In 1969, the last episode of Star Trek had aired, and the show had been cancelled. Despite the show having built up a passionate and loyal fan base, its overall viewing figures and troublesome behind-the-scenes antics led distributor NBC to discontinue the show. Its creative team and cast had moved on to other projects. They were happy to leave what they saw as a good series which unfortunately had never achieved the success it perhaps deserved. Going into the 70s, however, few were expecting the name Star Trek to come back into the popular consciousness. Against all the odds, however, it did just that. In part 1 of this series, we mentioned how Star Trek as a series was owned by Desilu Productions and filmed at their studios. However, 7 years as sole owner and CEO, Lucille Ball, who had co-founded the studio, sold the company to Gulf Western, a large conglomerate which at the time had also recently acquired Paramount Pictures. Desilu Productions was then renamed Paramount Television. During the first season of Star Trek, syndication rights were picked up by Kaiser Broadcasting, with its vice president Richard Bloch apparently being quite the fan. Although shows at the time usually required 4 seasons of episodes for syndication, the rights were already purchased before cancellation, and so Kaiser Broadcasting began rerunning several episodes on local city stations. While NBC had doomed the show to the 10 PM Friday night time slot of death, Kaiser Broadcasting gave the show a much more suitable weekday evening slot of 6 PM, effective counter-programming while other large networks ran their news programs. This deal paid off in droves and ratings were strong, prompting other stations to purchase the syndication rights for themselves. By the early 1970s, Star Trek not only reclaimed its original audience, but amassed millions more new fans. It quickly became one of Paramount Television's most profitable shows, scoring high ratings across the USA and even in other countries. It had gone from a financial flop to a cult hit. The original fanbase eventually attended the very first Star Trek convention in New York City in January of 1972. After this, the term Trekkies, coined by science fiction editor Arthur W. Saha, rose in use to refer to the dedicated and often ridiculed fans. The rise in popularity led to the commission of Star Trek the Animated Series in 1973, which saw several unused scripts from the original show repurposed for animated installments. The early 70s also saw a slew of Star Trek toys and merchandise released. While the Mego Corporation did produce a line of well-received action figures, some merchandise from other companies were a little ridiculous, such as the infamous Star Trek helmet. Quite impressively, however, the widespread passion around Star Trek eventually led to the very first NASA space shuttle being renamed from Constitution to Enterprise, thanks once again to a fierce letter-writing campaign from Trekkies, this time not to a network executive, but to the President of the United States, Gerald Ford. Roddenberry and the cast of Star Trek attended the shuttle's first rollout ceremony, with its new name adorning the side. As Star Trek's popularity continued to rise, the concept of a Star Trek movie entered development. The idea of a Star Trek movie was first proposed by Gene Roddenberry as early as 1968, when the original show was still airing, during the World Science Fiction Convention. Spurred on by the enthusiastic fan campaigns which successfully got the show renewed for a second season, Roddenberry proposed a prequel which would tell the story of how the Enterprise crew met for the first time. This, however, never got off the ground. By 1975, however, Star Trek was a valuable commodity for Paramount, and so Roddenberry was given the chance to return to the franchise and develop a feature film. Roddenberry's first idea was a story he titled The God Thing. The story followed a now Admiral Kirk who reassembles his old crew when a godlike alien entity many miles across is seen hurtling towards the Earth. The entity would eventually be revealed as an artificial intelligence sent from another dimension, which Kirk would eventually return back to its home, and the Enterprise would resume exploring space for further adventures. The initial script, however, wasn't well received by Paramount, and they fielded ideas from other creatives, such as acclaimed science fiction author Ray Bradbury, Theodore Sturgeon, and Harlan Ellison, who had previously penned the Star Trek episode City on the Edge of Forever, often regarded as one of the very best of the original show. Ellison's script featured a reptilian race attempting to interfere with Earth history by creating a hybrid species which would supplant humanity. Allegedly, when a Paramount executive compared his idea to Chariots of the Gods, Ellison was enraged and withdrew from the project. Another idea from writers Robert Silverberg and John D. F. Black saw a black hole which threatened to consume all of existence. Roddenberry then teamed up with writer John Povil and proposed the idea of the Enterprise crew correcting an altered universe using time travel. Both ideas were rejected by Paramount. As more ideas continued to be thought up and rejected, a massive list of names was given over to Paramount to source potential writers and directors who could handle the project. Among these names were Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, and Steven Spielberg. While hindsight is 2020, at the time only Coppola had a true hit to his name. Lucas would be mostly known for THX 1138, and Spielberg was yet to make Jaws or Close Encounters of the Third Kind. After dozens of concepts and ideas, eventually one proposal did begin building steam. Writers Chris Bryant and Alan Scott's 20-page treatment entitled Planet of the Titans, to be directed by Philip Kaufman, who would later go on to direct the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which featured Leonard Nimoy opposite Donald Sutherland. Planet of the Titans would see the Enterprise crew encounter a mythical and powerful alien race, and eventually travel back millions of years and kick off humanity's own evolution. This film was said to have some truly far-out ideas, toying with the concept of the third eye and other New Age movement elements. At one point in development, Kaufman wrote a version of the script with Spock as the main character, with a Klingon arch-nemesis to be played by the legendary Toshiro Mifune. As a big fan of Akira Kurosawa movies, this concept certainly sounds cool to me at least. Two key concept artists were also brought onto the project, famed James Bond production designer Ken Adam and Ralph McQuarrie, who at the time had just completed concept art for Star Wars. Together they developed a number of designs and concept, including a refitted Enterprise with a flat triangular drive section, something which later inspired the design of the Crossfield class starship in Star Trek Discovery. Despite initial progress, however, script difficulties caused the project to stall once again. After years of development, Paramount decided to cancel their Star Trek movie, 3 months before the release of Star Wars. Instead, executive Barry Diller convinced Roddenberry to restart development of a new Star Trek as a TV show entitled Star Trek Phase 2. It was to be the flagship show of a new Paramount television network. Producer Harold Livingston, who would later go on to work on several Star Trek TV shows, was brought on to assemble the show's writer's room. Of the cast, only Leonard Nimoy refused to return for fear of typecasting. A new, younger Vulcan character named Zon was created, played by Daniel Gautreaux. For a new first officer, Roddenberry created Commander William Decker, and as a new navigator, he created Lieutenant Ilea. The pilot episode, In Thy Image, was loosely based on Roddenberry's initial movie pitch, The God Thing. Alan Dean Foster, who would later write Star Wars, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and many other novelized Star Trek and Star Wars books, worked with Harold Livingston to create the two-part episode. The script was extremely well received by Michael Eisner, who was CEO of Paramount Pictures at the time. He proclaimed it was worthy of a movie. By 1978, however, the monumental success of Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind convinced Paramount that Star Trek could be the next big science fiction hit. Just 2 weeks before the production of Phase 2 was set to start, Paramount cancelled the series in favour of making a feature film. Leonard Nimoy eventually agreed to return as Spock after fan outcry that the character would be absent. Daniel Gautreaux was recast in the eventual movie as Commander Branch. Stephen Collins was cast as William Decker, and Persis Kambata joined as Ilea. Star Trek the Motion Picture was announced in March 1978 during a massive press conference. Director Robert Wise, an Academy Award winner known for The Haunting, West Side Story, and The Day the Earth Stood Still, was brought on as director. On an initial budget of $15 million, the movie was at last green-lit. Filming began on August 7th, 1978. Despite the initial enthusiasm, difficulties soon arose surrounding the script. Harold Livingston and Robert Wise had clashed with Roddenberry several times throughout development of the story, and Livingston continued writing the script even after shooting was started.
We had 2 acts of a 3-act screenplay. Literally, we had 2 acts of a 3-act screenplay.
In order to make the release date that they wanted at the end of the year, we had to start shooting on the film before we had a final script all the way through.
Livingston at one point even called the story unworkable. Quote, "We had a marvellous antagonist, so omnipotent that for us to defeat it, or even communicate with it, or have any kind of relationship with it, made the initial concept of the story false. Here's this gigantic machine 1,000,000 years further advanced than we are. Now, how the hell can we possibly deal with this? On what level? As the story developed, everything worked until the very end. How do you resolve this thing? If humans can defeat this marvellous machine, it's really not so great, is it? Or if it is really great, will we like those humans who defeat it? Should they defeat it? Who is the hero anyway?" That was the problem. We experimented with all kinds of approaches. We didn't know what to do with the ending. We always ended up hitting a blank wall. End quote. The difficulties with the script concerned many of the actors who ended up contributing much of their own character material. Shatner often described the ending as a jigsaw puzzle. Pages of the script were not only being rewritten daily, but even hourly. It's estimated that of the original 150 pages of the screenplay, only 20 survived until the end of filming. Post-production also brought its share of difficulties. Star Wars and Close Encounters had massively raised the standard of visual effects in major films, and Paramount wanted to make sure their Star Trek movie was up to scratch. They first approached Douglas Trumbull, famed for his incredible work on Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. However, Trumbull was busy with other projects. Next, they went to John Dykstra, who had supervised the effects on Star Wars and created the revolutionary DykstraFlex motion control camera system. He too was unavailable. Eventually, Paramount settled on Robert Abel and Associates, known at the time for their pioneering work using digital visual effects. However, they were mostly known for television work, mostly commercials. They initially budgeted their VFX at $4 million, but as they began the work, it was clear they had underestimated the scale of the project and had to increase their estimates to $5 million. After a year of work, however, no one was satisfied with the finished shots. Abel and Associates was fired from the film. With a year of work and $5 million wasted, Paramount quickly approached Trumbull again as soon as he was available. With an extremely tight schedule and looming Christmas deadline, Paramount essentially gave Trumbull a blank check to get the VFX completed in time for release. After months of back-breaking work, the VFX were completed on time. For the film's score, Robert Wise had worked with composer Jerry Goldsmith on his previous film The Sand Pebbles, and was delighted when Paramount suggested him for the job. Roddenberry had previously approached Goldsmith to score The Cage, the original pilot for the Star Trek TV series, but was unavailable at the time. Goldsmith has since described his experience on Star Trek the Motion Picture as one of the best he has ever had. Goldsmith's influences were largely romantic and wanted to convey a sense of sweeping adventure. His first stab at scoring the film was ultimately rejected by Robert Wise.
I listened to the first couple of pieces and it didn't seem quite right to me. It seemed like I got visions of sailing ships somehow.
The scene of the flying up to the Enterprise was a big bombastic piece, and we all thought it was so wonderful. And to finish the sessions, and I'm patting myself on the back, and everybody's patting, it's great and all that. And he couldn't really articulate what was bothering him. He instinctually knew what was bothering him, but he couldn't say what was bothering him. So I said, we got to do that all over again. And so I was crushed.
Those were pretty frightening moments. Those are the type of moments where if you were going to start having a breakdown, that's when you were going to start doing it.
I said, well, what's bothering you? And he finally said, there's no theme. And I started thinking, theme? Oh. There's a love theme. I'd written a love theme. That was, but I mean, there was no Star Trek theme. I said, oh.
Yeah, when we took a little break and Jerry went away, and while we were doing some more work on the film, and then he came back with his revised score.
He'd come over to the house. And he had a bad day of the special effects, and he says, "I've had a really bad day today." He says, "Nothing's working right. I hope you got good news for me." So I remember the head of the music department at Fox, at Paramount, was there then. And we had rehearsed this, and I had two pianos in the living room, and we played it for him on the two pianos. That's it. It was like, why didn't you come up with that in the first place?
Another key element to the score was the blaster bar, created by musician Craig Huxley. A 12 to 15 foot long metal beam with long wires connected to amplifiers and played with an artillery shell. Goldsmith thought it was perfect for the otherworldly sounds of Voyager and featured it prominently in the score. While the scoring process was relatively relaxed, the mad dash to finish the film meant it was completed less than a week before its national release. After its troubled filming and post-production, the budget had swelled from $15 million to $26 million. When the development costs of the other film concepts in Phase 2 was factored in, Paramount had spent a collective $44 million on the movie, a massive sum at the time. But at last, Star Trek the Motion Picture was ready for release on December 7th, 1979. Like all things Star Trek, the motion picture carries a lot of nostalgia for me personally. I compulsively watched it as a child, awestruck by the visuals and swept along by the music. It was only as I entered my teens and started browsing internet fan sites that I discovered the controversial status of the film for many Trekkies. Viewing it today as an adult, it's not a movie which I dislike, but it's certainly one which earns its acquired taste. The motion picture has often been nicknamed the slow motion picture. After the fast-paced fisticuffs and phaser fights of the TV show, it must have been quite strange for fans at the time to be greeted with such a slow-feeling film. The movie is only just over 2 hours long, but it feels a lot longer while watching. The hastily delivered VFX shots often meant they were left in the edit in their entirety instead of being trimmed down. This results in scenes like the 5-minute long sequence of Kirk merely approaching the Enterprise in a shuttlecraft. There's very little in the film to really get the blood pumping. It takes almost 40 minutes of runtime until the Enterprise crew are finally all together to confront the approaching anomaly. However, I think a lot of this is due to some script issues as well. The charming banter between Kirk, Spock and McCoy doesn't really appear in the movie like it should. The only real relationship we have to invest in is between Decker and Ilea. And while the actors do a good job with what they're given, it's pretty thin material overall. Kirk actually comes off quite badly in the film. He pretty much wrestles control of the Enterprise away from its new captain for quite selfish reasons and makes numerous mistakes when it comes to ship operations. The production design may also play a part in the slow and sometimes dull feeling of the film. The original show was extremely colourful with bright uniforms and interiors. In the motion picture, however, a lot of that colour has vanished. The Enterprise interiors are all grey or silver, and the uniforms have turned into dull blues, greys, and beiges. Matt Jeffries, the original designer of the Enterprise, was extremely disappointed by the redesigns in the film, and says he even fell asleep while watching it. The visual effects work is mostly outstanding, save for a few nitpicks here and there. The matte painting on Vulcan, for example, doesn't really work. It's a messy design which fails to draw the eye and doesn't seem to really match the live-action footage. When the film goes into space, however, the effects truly shine. This is quite simply one of the most visually spectacular movies I have ever personally seen. The miniature work here is virtually flawless. While we could quibble about a few matte lines here and there, the Enterprise and other ships are incredibly detailed and lifelike. The optical work in creating the Voyager cloud is some of the best which has ever been done in a movie. Looking at it today, you would assume a lot of it is done in a computer, and it racks the brain to think how it was done with the processes at the time. While the effects work doesn't quite match the standard of Trumbull's work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, it easily matches and in some cases surpasses the work done on Star Wars and Close Encounters. Many years later, Robert Wise was able to tweak the film slightly in his director's cut, and the weaker effects were largely improved. The Vulcan sequence really works now, and other matte paintings have been improved. If you've only ever seen the original theatrical cut, I would highly recommend this version, as it fixes some other issues as well. Jerry Goldsmith's score is one of, if not his best scores ever. I put it in the top spot of my top 10 sci-fi movie soundtracks, but even outside that genre, the work is astounding. Goldsmith earned well-deserved Oscar, Grammy, and Nebula Award nominations, and it's a shame he didn't win them. His iconic central theme weaves its way into the brain and remains there pretty much for forever. But outside of that, the intricate work on Voyager and his use of blaster bar runs the gamut of existential terror and cathartic relief by the film's climax. It's a score which is on a permanent rotation in my playlist. It's simply brilliant. As someone with a love for spaceships and alien vistas, there is a part of me which is able to get swept up in the rhythm of Star Trek the Motion Picture. It doesn't really bother me that the dry dock sequence is 5 minutes long. The technical craft which is being both seen and heard is enough to keep my attention for much of the film. And for a film with such a messy script, the ending is truly inspired. The revelation of Voyager as Voyager 6, Earth's own satellite lost and modified by a race of artificial beings, is brilliant. The themes surrounding the meaning of life, the search for a purpose, and rebirth into a higher life form hits the right balance of being both cosmic in scale, but also deeply personal and relatable. While much of the film's character work is lacking, this climactic scene really brings it all together and hits the bullseye. The journey to get to this point is certainly uneven and dull, but in my estimation, the wait is well worth it. That being said though, it's probably accurate to say the plot was much too thin for the length of the film. This is another issue somewhat remedied in the later director's cut, and numerous fan edits over the years have done a good job of speeding up the pace to make a solid 1 hour 40-minute movie. Despite its flaws, however, for me personally, this is still an enjoyable film. Its themes are fascinating and technical achievements astonishing. Even if it becomes a real slog at various points, it's not a film I could ever truly dislike. The release of Star Trek the Motion Picture was a highly anticipated one, but unfortunately the film met with a mixed reception to say the least. Many critics took issue with its slow pace and messy script. The fan reception was similarly divided. After so many years waiting to see Star Trek return, many were very disappointed by its big screen debut. The cast and crew were also quite disappointed, feeling the motion picture lacked the heart of Star Trek.
Here's the ship going this way. Here's the ship going that way. Here's the ship coming toward us. Where's the story?
Its box office was also a bit of a letdown. While the film did go on to gross $140 million worldwide, compared to the contemporary blockbusters Paramount was looking to match, Star Trek the Motion Picture failed to meet expectations. Once again, the future of the Star Trek franchise was in doubt. While the box office results weren't what Paramount wanted, they acknowledged there was an audience out there who would be keen to see Kirk, Spock and McCoy in another, albeit cheaper, big screen adventure. Star Trek the Motion Picture was met with a mixed reaction from both critics and audiences, and its box office didn't match the blockbuster contemporaries Paramount Pictures was hoping for. However, the studio executives acknowledged there was still an audience out there for a Star Trek movie, and so decided to move forward with the next installment, hoping this time they'd get it right. Gene Roddenberry, the man who had created the original idea for Star Trek in the first place, offered his own script for a sequel. In Roddenberry's script, the Klingons travelled back in time using the Guardian of Forever, seen previously in the excellent City on the Edge of Forever, and stop the assassination of John F. Kennedy, corrupting the timeline. Thus it would be up to the Enterprise crew to set things right. Paramount flatly rejected this idea. In fact, Paramount pinned much of the blame for the motion picture's lukewarm reception on Roddenberry himself. He was a famously slow, plodding writer, even during the original series. This was one of the reasons the motion picture began shooting without a completed script. There was also an antagonistic relationship between Roddenberry and writer Harold Livingston, as Roddenberry often took credit for work Livingston had actually done. To stop these same problems happening with the next Star Trek movie, Paramount removed Roddenberry from the project and gave him the title of creative consultant. This was a purely ceremonial position. This meant the team who would come in to craft the next Star Trek film would have to run their ideas by Roddenberry. However, they were under no obligation to adhere to any of his recommendations. To produce the film, Paramount looked to Harve Bennett, a recent addition to Paramount Television at the time. He had previously worked at Universal with Battlestar Galactica creator Glenn A. Larson on The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman. For Paramount Television, he had produced the television movie A Woman Called Golda, which starred Ingrid Bergman in her final role. The TV movie went on to be nominated for 7 Emmy Awards, winning 3, and won a posthumous Golden Globe for Bergman herself. Leonard Nimoy also starred in the film and was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actor. Nimoy was thrilled when he discovered Paramount was tapping Bennett for the next Star Trek film. Bennett had a reputation as a hard worker who was often able to get a lot done with a tight budget and strict schedule. He was called into a meeting at Paramount with executives which included Jeffrey Katzenberg, Michael Eisner, and Charles Bluhdorn from Paramount's parent company Gulf Western. According to Bennett, he was asked by Eisner, "Do you think you can make a better movie than the motion picture?" Bennett confessed that he found the first Star Trek movie quite boring. Bennett answered yes to the question. Charles Bluhdorn then asked, "Can you make it for less than $45 million? Bennett replied, "Where I come from, I can make 5 movies for that." Bennett was soon given the job. Having landed the project, Bennett had a tough task ahead of him, as he had, in fact, never seen a single episode of Star Trek. A problem which he believed plagued the motion picture was a lack of a good central antagonist. So he began combing through old episodes of the series to see what he could find. Eventually, he found exactly what he was looking for with Space Seed. Space Seed was an episode from the original series I chose not to talk about in detail during part 1 of this series because I knew I would be talking about it more for this video. Space Seed sees the Enterprise come across the SS Botany Bay, a centuries-old ship from a devastating war in Earth's past. Aboard the ship are some 72 living men and women, genetically engineered superhumans who attempted to conquer the Earth. After their leader, Khan Noonien Singh, is revived, he quickly plots a takeover of the ship to re-embark on his quest for dominance. It's easy to see why Bennett thought he'd found the cornerstone of the next Star Trek movie. Ricardo Montalban is simply phenomenal as Khan. He oozes quiet confidence and menace, not to mention is truly believable as a ruthless conqueror. Yet at the same time, the character is the perfect foil for Kirk. Khan ultimately cares deeply for his comrades in the same way Kirk does for his own crew, and just as Kirk often bucks authority or violates regulations if it means helping his friends, Khan is willing to do anything for his people. While Star Trek the original series is certainly full of great villains, Khan's depth of character and Montalban's Shakespearean screen presence dominate the episode. We truly get the sense that not only has Kirk met his match, but the entire Enterprise crew have. It's a good episode elevated to greatness by this character and this performance. After his appearance on Star Trek, Montalban continued to work tirelessly on both stage and screen. By the 80s, however, he was somewhat of a household name for his role as Mr. Rourke on Fantasy Island. This show was enormously successful, running for 7 seasons and over 150 episodes. When Bennett approached Montalban about reprising the role of Khan, the producer made sure to work around his schedule for Fantasy Island. However, it took some time for the actor to settle back into his Star Trek role.
When they offered me the part, it isn't that I think that there is a part that is too small for me, no, but there was in a way because after 6 years of Fantasy Island, which was a very successful series, I wanted to be on the screen with a more important role, you know. When I read it, I thought something. I thought, well, when I am not on the screen, they're talking about me. So it seemed, and besides, it's an interesting role. I think I can do something with it. However, I said, okay, I'll do it. I began getting acquainted with the character, which I had to bring from way back. And I began to then to articulate as I memorized the dialogue. And to my terrible despair, I sounded to me like Mr. Rourke of Fantasy Island. Say the audiences are going to laugh me off the screen. They're going to believe that I am Khan, the Superman. I sound like Rourke. What is it? What is it? What is it? So I called Harvey Bennett. Harvey, could you send me a print of the original Space Seed? And he sent me it, you know. And I played it, and I played it again about 3 times. About the 3rd time, I began to remember what I thought then as an actor, what I was trying to accomplish, or what I did accomplish, whatever. And all of a sudden, it came to me. So what I have to do now is bring that character, and then make it passionate, because he's blaming Kirk for the death of his wife, whom he loved passionately. And so he was revenge. And so I have to play this character fully. I'm not going to play it safe. Play it safe. No, I want to play it full of passion. Vengeance, not for himself, but for the memory of his wife, whom he adored. And all of a sudden I began to read it, and to my, I was convinced by that time that Mr. Rourke had disappeared, and that indeed I had become Khan, you know.
Having found his chief villain, Bennett hired Robert Sallin as another producer and Michael Miner as art director while he worked on the story. His first treatment was titled War of the Generations. This story saw Kirk investigating rebellion on a distant world, only to find his own son leading it and Khan pulling the strings. Bennett then hired avid Star Trek fan and writer Jack B. Sowards to turn his treatment into a script. Sowards would later go on to write the episode Where Silence Has Lease for Star Trek The Next Generation. His chief contribution to Star Trek II was creating the Kobayashi Maru test, a Starfleet Academy exercise designed to teach cadets about a no-win scenario, which Kirk cheated at to pass in his younger years. Sowards' script, titled The Omega Syndrome, featured the theft of a powerful destructive weapon called the Omega System. However, Bennett found the plot of a superweapon too cliched. It was Michael Miner who suggested changing it to a terraforming device. Allegedly, Bennett gave Miner a hug after this suggestion and declared that he had saved Star Trek. Sowards then renamed the device to the Genesis device. An early component of the story which all of the creative team were sure of was the decision to kill off Spock. The exact reasoning for this is something I will tackle in detail during part 4 of this retrospective series. Originally, this death was to happen early in the film. Bennett compared it to Janet Leigh being shockingly killed off in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. However, when a leaked version of this script was seen by many Star Trek fans, they were horrified. The creative team were soon inundated with furious fan mail from Trekkies, demanding they reverse their decision. Some fans even took out paid advertisements in popular magazines to voice their anger. Some fans even expressed the sentiment, "If Spock dies, you die." Most absurd of all, Leonard Nimoy himself received death threats. I just want to take a quick aside here to say this is quite possibly the dumbest thing any Star Trek fan has ever done. This reaction prompted Sowards to move Spock's death to later in the story. As the script continued to develop, writer Samuel A. Peebles, who had previously written the teleplay for the original series Where No Man Has Gone Before, and had worked on Star Trek the Animated Series, was allowed to pitch his own ideas. Peebles' script replaced Khan with two powerful alien villains called Sojin and Moray. However, this idea was deemed too typical of an older Star Trek episode. Despite some other good ideas being brought forward, the script simply wasn't coming together in a way which was liked by all of the team. As deadlines loomed, a Paramount executive named Karen Moore suggested Bennett reach out to a then 36-year-old Nicholas Meyer. Meyer had received some acclaim for his Sherlock Holmes pastiche novel, The 7% Solution, which was later adapted into a film. Since then, he had contributed to television movies such as Judge Dee and the Monastery Murders, as well as The Night That Panicked America. But he made his directorial debut in 1979 with Time After Time. If you haven't seen this hidden gem of a film, then I would highly recommend seeking it out. It was a real delight for me to watch in researching for this video. Time After Time, and if you're wondering, yes, this film did actually inspire that Cyndi Lauper song of the same name, stars David Warner and Malcolm McDowell, both of whom would later join the Star Trek franchise as Jack the Ripper and H.G. Wells, the latter of which has recently built a time machine. When the Ripper's identity is uncovered, he escapes into 1979 San Francisco, where Wells soon follows. It's a wonderfully daft premise, a schlocky, pulpy story elevated by great filmmaking craft, strong writing, and terrific performances from the entire cast. Meyer essentially retrofits a Holmes versus Moriarty battle of wits between frenemies onto the dynamic between Wells and the Ripper, identified in the film as Dr. John Leslie Stevenson. Warner is effortlessly cool and sinister, whereas McDowell, in a rare turn as the film's hero, is wonderfully sincere and absurdly polite. There's a great clash of worldviews on display here. Wells, being an earlier stage of his life, is full of optimism, believing the world will naturally trend towards a socialist utopia within his own lifetime, while Stevenson believes humanity is a slave to its baser desires and can never achieve true prosperity. The movie is a true showcase of Meyer's ability to pull from the strengths of disparate genres in order to create a unique and enjoyable story. Here he mixes much of the themes of Wells' own work with an Arthur Conan Doyle murder mystery. Also, this time machine is simply adorable looking. If you're interested in more of Meyer's work, I would also highly recommend the 1983 TV movie The Day After, as well as virtually every interview and commentary you can get your hands on. He's truly a fascinating person and a unique creative voice who I personally count as one of my idols. Like Bennett, Meyer had never seen a single episode of Star Trek, which he later reflected was one of his strengths in approaching the project. He said, "The chief contribution I brought to Star Trek was a healthy disrespect. Star Trek was human allegory in space format. That was both its strength and ultimately its weakness. I tried through irreverence to make them more human and a little less wooden. I didn't insist Captain Kirk go to the bathroom, but did Star Trek have to be so sanctified?" Meyer pulled from many naval literature influences, describing his vision as Hornblower in space, referring to C.S. Forester's Horatio Hornblower novels, of which he was a fan. Purely by coincidence, Roddenberry cited this same novel series as a primary inspiration for his creation of Star Trek. Meyer included much more naval terminology and procedure in the depiction of ship operations. He added in a ship's bell, boatswain's whistle, and asked the uniforms to be more military-like, as he often referred to the uniforms of the original series as looking like pajamas. Meyer also drew from Moby Dick in crafting Khan's character. He and Montalban agreed that every villain sees themselves as the hero of their own story. Montalban particularly liked Khan's quoting of Moby Dick in his pursuit of Kirk. Meyer and Montalban got on famously well during production, with Meyer often proclaiming Montalban as being wasted by most of Hollywood, and I have to say I agree.
Montalban is a great actor, was a great actor. Wasted, like most actors. And he didn't know me. He was very courteous man, very gentleman, courtly, I think. Came in, letter perfect for these 6 pages, hit every mark, boom, 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 boom. And he was screaming the whole thing at the top of his lungs. It was just like, whoa, and everybody was standing there. And I'm thinking, this is the second movie I've ever directed. This man, if we just typed up his credits, are taller than I am. You know, it's a long list. What is he going to do if I start telling him things? And I really didn't know. So I said, okay, well, now they're going to do their lighting. Let's go back in your trailer and we can, chat a little bit about the character. And I went in there and he's sitting there opaquely waiting. And I said, Laurence Olivier once said that an actor should never show an audience his top. Because once you show your top, they know you got no place else to go. And he looks at me and goes, "Oh, you're going to direct me." He said, "That's really good. I need direction. I don't know what I'm doing up there." And then he started to tell me stories about Mervyn LeRoy and all these other directors they work with who would say to him, "Ricardo, make it a good scene."
Gene Roddenberry, however, hated these additions to the script. He saw Meyer's approach to Star Trek as being too militant, not in line with his vision of a peaceful utopian future. The creative team, however, ignored his notes. From then on, Meyer and Roddenberry had a famously antagonistic relationship. When Meyer came on board, he set about crafting a new draft of the screenplay. He made a note of everyone's favourite elements of the previous draft at that point, in an attempt to incorporate them into a strong, streamlined story. To offset fan backlash, Meyer added in an early scene in which Spock appears to die during the Kobayashi Maru training sequence, hoping fans would believe this was the apparent death which they had heard about. After Meyer made these notes, he needed to complete the new draft of the screenplay in only 12 days, so the VFX and production design teams could begin work. Meyer was able to complete the new script on time, uncredited and for no pay, which impressed many of the veteran crew members. And in contrast to Roddenberry's slow delivery of rewrites, Meyer was able to make further adjustments to the script at a rapid pace. With a solid script ready to go, the only other element left to do was to settle on a title. Originally the film was titled The Vengeance of Khan. However, at the time, the third installment of the Star Wars franchise was titled Revenge of the Jedi, and 20th Century Fox requested Paramount change their Star Trek title in order to avoid brand confusion, and Paramount obliged. Eventually, however, the same Star Wars film would change its title to Return of the Jedi. Among the titles considered for the new Star Trek was The Undiscovered Country, which was later used for the 6th Star Trek film. However, the team eventually settled on The Wrath of Khan, and the movie was ready to shoot. True to Bennett's reputation as a man who could get things done cheaply and quickly, every dollar of the film's budget was stretched. Sets, props, models, and even finished shots from the motion picture were reused and cannibalized for The Wrath of Khan. Over 60% of the film's principal photography took place on the same bridge set, which was simply redressed to be the Enterprise, Reliant, or training simulator whenever needed. The Klingon bridge from the motion picture was redressed and reused for both the Enterprise torpedo bay and the Regular One transporter room. The Regular One station itself was the same model station from the motion picture, but flipped upside down and retouched. Meyer and Bennett utilized many camera tricks to eschew the need to build expansive large sets. Instead, they used simple forced perspective for the Enterprise's main engineering and for Starfleet Academy. For the uniforms, costume designer Robert Fletcher settled on a warm red for the Starfleet uniforms, again aligning with Meyer's naval influences. For Khan and his followers, Fletcher envisioned them as making their clothing out of whatever they could find. He designed Khan's costume with an open chest to show off Montalban's physique. There was often a lot of speculation that Montalban wore a fake chest for this movie. However, according to everyone who worked on the film, Montalban was simply a muscular person who enjoyed working out. This enhanced the idea that Khan was the physical superior to Kirk. For the visual effects of the film, rather than Douglas Trumbull, Paramount turned to Industrial Light and Magic, made famous for their work on Star Wars. Paramount didn't want a repeat of the long and costly processes of Star Trek the Motion Picture, so Nicholas Meyer and all relevant department heads spent 6 weeks storyboarding and designing every effect sequence in the film in painstaking detail. Once all of these sequences were locked, the team ILM went to work creating the sequences using miniatures and other techniques. The Enterprise miniature from the motion picture was reused, albeit with slightly dulled colours and slightly altered hull details. Allegedly, the model teams hated working on the Enterprise for its complex internal wiring, immense weight, and awkward mount points. The USS Reliant, on the other hand, was much easier to work with. Originally, the Reliant was meant to be a Constitution-class ship like the Enterprise. However, while designing the space battles, there was concern that audiences would get confused between the two ships, so designers Joe Jennings and Michael Miner designed the Miranda-class ship instead. This was the first ever Starfleet vessel to be seen in the Star Trek franchise other than the Constitution class. The models were shot using the tried and true motion control camera system, which was invented by John Dykstra, who had supervised some of the effects for the motion picture. For the Mutara Nebula, the team injected a latex and ammonia mix into a water tank, which was then lit using colored gels and shot with a low-speed camera. A famous effect used in the film was the pioneering use of CGI for a sequence depicting what the Genesis device was capable of. Lucasfilm had been funding an in-house computer graphics group. Impressed by their research into this new technology, effects supervisor Jim Velou asked them to create cinema's first fully computer-generated sequence. This computer graphics group would later branch off from Lucasfilm to become Pixar Animation. Another computer graphics company, Evans and Sutherland, also broke ground with digital effects. They used a system called Digistar, originally created for planetariums, to create computer-generated star fields. These were used for the opening credits and closing shot of the film, and were also mixed with traditional matte work in various shots throughout the movie. For the film's score, Paramount, perhaps in yet another attempt to distance Wrath of Khan from the motion picture, decided not to use any of Jerry Goldsmith's work from the previous film and wanted to hire a new composer. Nicholas Meyer suggested a then 28-year-old James Horner, who once again had never seen a single episode of Star Trek. Horner had come from the Roger Corman Film School, scoring many B-movies such as Battle Beyond the Stars and Humanoids from the Deep. Battle Beyond the Stars also had its effects created by James Cameron, who Horner would later work with 3 times on Aliens, Titanic, and Avatar. But now I'm getting sidetracked. He had come to know Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams, and was technically proficient in the realm of scoring for film. At first, Bennett asked Horner to reproduce the theme from the original series. However, Horner and Meyer both wanted to create something new.
I believe that you had to have 2, maybe maximum 3 themes that an audience could keep track of. And then it was important that 3 themes be your principal themes, and then have maybe a motif or 2 that were very short but narrated other things. And themes tended to be long melodies. and the motifs could be short blasts of things. Khan didn't have a long theme. Khan had a high sort of warlike thing that I did in the high French horns, which was da 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 da, and it's very short, and it's accompanied with this sort of percussion da 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 sort of figure. But it helps you know right away that that's Khan's music, and it's very short and distinctive. And that plays against the theme of the Enterprise, which is a long melodic thing. I wanted it to be really something that was strong and warlike, and to me, the high horns, in terms of color, did that. Not the trumpets, but in terms of sheer power, I think it was 8 French horns did that. It was something that I could play that was a short blast of power. It wasn't really a theme, it was just sort of a motif for Khan. And then I could do that, and then when you cut back to Kirk, you could have Kirk's theme very simply dun 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 bum dun, and it was that motif, and then you could cut away to so that these chases could be very easily theme driven, because there was a lot of battle music, and it was incessant, and I had to find a way to musically say who was what and what was who and who was damaged, who was not damaged. And that helped a great deal knowing how the battle was going. And I think that is really, really important when you are having long battle sequences. Otherwise, it's just action music. Fire.
Fire!
As opposed to the mad dash to finish the motion picture, Bennett's efficient and cost-effective running of the production meant it finished comfortably on time. On June 4th, 1982, the second Star Trek movie was released. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is often held up as the best movie in the Star Trek franchise, and for good reason. While my own personal preferences in terms of my favourite big screen outing varies over time, The Wrath of Khan is comfortably near the top of my own rankings, as I believe it is with most people. In terms of pacing, character depth and narrative themes, it's a big improvement on Star Trek the Motion Picture. One aspect in which it doesn't live up to its predecessor, however, is in its overall production value. The lower budget for the movie certainly shows on screen. Much of the production was supervised by those from Paramount's television unit rather than feature film veterans. That's not to say the finished movie looks bad, in fact quite the opposite. But there's an epic scope and sweeping spectacle present in the motion picture, which doesn't carry over to The Wrath of Khan. That being said, the revamped production design is certainly a step in the right direction compared to the motion picture's dull palette of greys, light blues and beige. The red uniforms featured in this film onwards are some of my personal favourites, and in general the sets feel much more lively than they did before. The Enterprise feels much more like a ship inhabited by people rather than a cold device. ILM's work on the film is no substitute for the lavish work of Douglas Trumbull, but the miniatures and optical work look brilliant. The ships feel like they have real weight and power to them. Each flyby of the Reliant and the Enterprise is simply gorgeous to watch. Nicholas Meyer's direction is economical but highly effective. Not as flashy as the likes of Spielberg or De Palma, but Meyer showcases a true command of scenic blocking and visual storytelling. Scenes are assembled from simple camera moves, but the construction of the scenes themselves lends the film a great sense of pacing. Plenty of quiet moments to follow our characters and then drawing us in with high-stakes tension, only to blow us into the back of our seats with explosive action. There's a clear difference between a director who shoots using coverage for them to find the story in the edit, and a director who knows exactly how to tell their story before they ever set foot on set. Meyer is clearly the latter. While Jerry Goldsmith's score for Star Trek the Motion Picture is one of my favourite film scores of all time, and his Star Trek theme is still what I think of as the Star Trek theme, James Horner's work on Star Trek II is simply wonderful. His work totally captures the swashbuckling hornblower in space feeling Meyer was going for. His new theme for the film is majestic and memorable. His mix of motifs and themes for the battle sequences packs in a lot of emotion to already spectacular sequences. What's especially strong, however, are his contributions to the emotional core of the film. Meyer adds in this very ethereal yet heartwarming theme representing Kirk and Spock's friendship. It's subtle, but it's something which plays throughout the entire film, building until it reaches Spock's ultimate demise, where Horner truly uses the music to break your heart. James Horner is one of my personal favourite composers in general, and I love his score for The Wrath of Khan. The high strings and blasting horns are trademarks of his, which he used throughout his career and are established first with Star Trek. Just like Goldsmith's motion picture soundtrack, Horner's Wrath of Khan is an absolute masterpiece which any avid music fan should own. What truly makes The Wrath of Khan shine is the excellent script, which presents us with real human relationships and personal themes which many felt was missing from the motion picture. The dialogue between Kirk, Spock and Bones is witty and fun, quite possibly the best iteration of this dynamic in the entire franchise. Ricardo Montalban is a truly exceptional villain, easily topping his previous performance in Space Seed. The Captain Ahab drive for revenge and wonderfully flowery dialogue cement Khan's status as Kirk's ultimate arch-nemesis. But while Montalban often steals the scene, this is also one of Shatner's best performances as Kirk, if not the best. His signature cadence is still there, of course, but Meyer's ability in utilising the strengths of his actors results in a nuanced and heartfelt portrayal of the character. Later Star Trek stories involving Kirk, particularly the likes of the later Star Trek V, often feel like painful attempts at returning Kirk to his days of fisticuffs and womanizing. The Wrath of Khan, however, wisely chooses to move the character forward into new territory. Kirk's refusal to accept change in his life, always clinging onto the glory days, perfectly comes back to bite him when a relic of those glory days reappears to threaten his life, and he is unexpectedly confronted by his estranged adult son. All of it builds until the moment Spock chooses to sacrifice himself in order to save the ship. It's surprising when looking back on the film, Spock isn't much of a major player for most of the story. While there are plenty of great moments between the two friends, Spock doesn't have much bearing on the overall story until this pivotal moment, and perhaps that's what makes it all the more impactful. Meyer's brilliant visual storytelling lets a subtle sense of dread rise in the viewer as we see Spock make the crucial decision which will ultimately end his life. The moment Kirk looks over to see the empty chair on the bridge, Kirk's expression conveying his realization of what's just happened, and his frantic run down to engineering as we intercut with the birth of a new world, it is absolutely brilliant storytelling craft. Even now, having seen the final goodbye between the two friends many times now, it still makes me choke up a bit.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend. Live long and prosper.
Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is a spectacular swashbuckling adventure filled with some of the best space battles ever committed to film. Yet it's also a moving, personal story about letting go of the past, growing old, death, and rebirth. Written, produced, and directed by a creative team who knew next to nothing about Star Trek, they were able to find and distill on screen what makes Star Trek so special to so many. Upon release, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan became an unabashed hit, critically and commercially. Its success was credited with saving the franchise from another potential demise. When it seemed the future was uncertain for Star Trek, this team of outsiders had cracked the code for further adventures on the big screen. The film was nominated for Best Dramatic Presentation at the 1983 Hugo Awards and won 2 Saturn Awards, Best Actor for William Shatner and Best Director for Nicholas Meyer. Fans who had been disappointed by the motion picture were thrilled with this follow-up installment. Many proclaimed that the spirit of Star Trek had successfully been recaptured. While the film only grossed $97 million worldwide when compared to the $140 million of the motion picture, thanks to its lower production budget and strong home video sales, it was far more profitable than its first big screen outing. Bennett, Meyer and co. had done it. Star Trek was back, a valued franchise for its studio and an adored pop culture icon for fans. Another installment was soon put into development, but where would the series go from here? It seems a few last-minute additions to the shooting schedule would give some fans a tantalizing clue. Star Trek the Motion Picture wasn't the triumphant return for the franchise many fans wanted. However, thanks to the combined efforts of producer Harve Bennett, director Nicholas Meyer and many others, Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan was a welcome return to form. But with such a high bar now set, what could a follow-up film do to satisfy fans? To fully explore the development of Star Trek's third big screen installment, we must delve into Leonard Nimoy's personal history with the franchise. During the run of the original series, Spock was the clear fan favourite among the cast of characters. Nimoy's excellent performance combined with the strong writing made them the de facto iconic character of the burgeoning franchise. Following the cancellation of the original series, Star Trek exploded in popularity a few years afterwards due to the successful and very popular reruns. Paramount, suddenly finding themselves with a valuable commodity, capitalized on this popularity through a number of means, including merchandising. However, it was because of this merchandising, Leonard Nimoy's relationship with Star Trek was eventually misunderstood by many. Naturally, the character of Spock was used heavily in the resulting merchandise. However, Leonard Nimoy didn't see any of the royalties he had expected for the use of his likeness. His requests to be paid his due from Paramount often fell on deaf ears, leading Nimoy to eventually file a lawsuit against Paramount in order to receive the royalties he was owed. As a result, this often made Nimoy hesitant to return to the role of Spock for the myriad of potential Star Trek movies which were being developed throughout the 1970s. However, this dispute over royalties wasn't known to fans or indeed many production staff. This, combined with the publication of Nimoy's 1975 autobiography entitled I Am Not Spock, led many to believe the actor was weary of typecasting at best or hated Star Trek at worst. This was why the character of Zon was created for the unmade Star Trek Phase 2 show, to replace Spock as a regular character if Nimoy refused to reprise his role. However, when Star Trek the Motion Picture went into production, Paramount finally settled the lawsuit and Nimoy signed on to return as Spock. For The Wrath of Khan, however, producer Harve Bennett and Paramount executive Michael Eisner were those of the belief that Nimoy hated Star Trek and was not interested in returning for more films. This mistaken belief was what partly motivated the Wrath of Khan creative team to kill off the character for the sequel. During production, however, through casual conversations between Nimoy and Bennett, the producer discovered his assumptions were wrong. Leonard Nimoy in fact loved Star Trek and relished playing Spock. Upon first reading the script for The Wrath of Khan, the actor was naturally disappointed to see his character be killed off, but he also recognised the high quality of the story and thought it was a fitting send-off for the character. That being said, while talking to Bennett, Nimoy did confess he would have liked the opportunity to continue playing the character if possible. As shooting continued on The Wrath of Khan, Bennett began considering the possibility of resurrecting the character for the next big screen outing. After principal photography had wrapped, The Wrath of Khan was then shown to test audiences who reacted negatively to the character's death and what they believed was a depressing ending to the film. This convinced Paramount to sign off on some last-minute additional scenes to the movie. The first was an incredibly quick shot in which Spock, having knocked out Dr. McCoy in order to reach the reactor core, executes a quick mind meld and cryptically says the word "remember." The second addition was a lingering shot of the torpedo which contained the deceased Spock's body, resting on the Genesis planet where a thick fog soon rolls over the makeshift coffin. These additional scenes and the suggestion of bringing back Spock for the next Star Trek film repulsed writer-director Nicholas Meyer, and he refused to return to write or direct the follow-up film. However, this presented an opportunity for the Spock actor. Nimoy had had a long desire to try his hand at directing, and with his services now in demand for the next installment, petitioned Paramount to give him the chance at being behind the camera. After persuading Michael Eisner he was still enthusiastic about being a part of the Star Trek franchise, he was given the job. Star Trek 3 was then greenlit only the day after The Wrath of Khan had opened. Harve Bennett's first treatment for the film was titled Star Trek 3 Return to Genesis. Bennett began tackling the story by starting with its final scene, specifically a line of dialogue from Spock which read, "Your name is Jim," and he worked back from there. His full treatment saw Romulans as the primary antagonists, who set up illegal mining operations on the Genesis world. However, reports soon surfaced of Romulan miners being killed by an unknown feral being, who would later be revealed to be the rapidly aging regenerated Spock. The plot would also see the Vulcans being horrified at the Federation developing such a potentially devastating weapon as the Genesis device that they threatened to secede from the Federation itself. This story was said to be much darker and more serious in tone to the final film, and with a Romulan antagonist similar to the Romulan captain we first saw in the original series episode Balance of Terror. Bennett and Nimoy both wanted to strive for a story which was epic in scope and operatic in tone. However, when Bennett's initial treatment was leaked to fans, he was forced to rewrite many key plot elements, as the key twist of Spock being resurrected was now public knowledge. Afterwards, security for the production was severely tightened to ensure there were no more leaks. During this rewrite, it was Nimoy who suggested changing the villains from Romulans to Klingons, as he felt they better fit his operatic tone he was going for. Bennett and Nimoy took the Klingons in a new direction in terms of characterization. Rather than the brutal conquerors of the original series, they wanted to ground the characters with more understandable motivations. This led to them taking inspiration from Japanese samurai and the concept of their Bushido code of honor. The Klingons were no longer power-hungry one-dimensional villains, but warriors with their own moral code who make sacrifices for what they see as being the good of their people. As a result of this came the scene in which Klingon Commander Krug kills his own lover in order to safeguard the secrecy of their mission. More involved scenes with the Klingon crew were also added into the script, and this led to the development of the Klingon language. In the original series episode The Trouble with Tribbles, one Klingon makes a reference to his native language being Klingonese. This idea was later expressed in the opening scene of the motion picture, in which 3 Klingon ships face off against V'ger. The words spoken for this scene were actually devised by James Doohan, who played Scotty. Essentially, it was just a series of guttural noises for basic words which were being said. However, for Star Trek 3, Bennett and Nimoy wanted a real working language for the film, and so they turned to Mark Okrand. An accomplished linguist who primarily studied Native American languages, he was originally brought on to Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan to develop the Vulcan language for a short scene between Spock and Saavik. The scene was originally recorded with the actors speaking English, but later redubbed with new Vulcan words which Okrand made up to fit the lip movements of the actors. For Star Trek III, however, he had a much larger task ahead of him.
So, for example, one of the phrases in Star Trek the Motion Picture is we cha. So there's those sounds. I started making a list, an inventory of what the sounds are. So we cha, there's a w. I'm putting them in different parts of the chart here. There's a e, there's a ch. And the way linguists write, that's a number of ways linguists write that, but one of them is C with a little thing on it that's a ch. There's a ah. Okay, so we cha. I'm writing them all over the place here because I'm going to end up filling out a full chart. Those 4 sounds have to be sounds in the Klingon that I'm coming up with because they were in the original film. So I charted out all the sounds from the original film, and there was some, but not enough. I had to add more to make Klingon be a real language. Otherwise, all the words would sound alike because there'd be so few sounds. So in adding the sounds, I paid attention to a couple of things. One was that according to the script for Star Trek III, Klingon is a guttural language. It says in the script that Krug, who's the main Klingon villain in the film, says in his guttural Klingon, and then there's the line. Well, if Krug is supposed to speak in guttural Klingon, I better add some guttural sounds. So I added a sound and a sound, which is different. Well, in addition to the sounds, I had to worry about the grammar of the language. You can't just throw words together in somewhere or other. A language is more than just its dictionary. Right? If I gave you a dictionary of French and said, okay, go ahead and speak French, you wouldn't know what to do. And it's the same thing with Klingon. So it's not just a list of words. So I had to figure out what the grammar was going to be. Well, what does that mean? That means the basic word order. Are there going to be prefixes and suffixes? Are there going to be tenses and plurals and all that kind of thing? And I honestly, at this point, don't remember what I did first or how I decided what when. But I do remember some of the thinking that went into what I chose to do. So for example, the basic order of the words I had to figure out. Sort of the three basic elements in a sentence are the subject, the verb, and the object. The subject is who's doing the action, the verb is what is the action, and the object is who's receiving the action, assuming that that's appropriate to the sentence. It doesn't have to be there. So in English, this is the order. The subject and then verb and then the object. Dogs bite people. Mathematically, for these three elements, there's 6 possible combinations. In other words, there's the subject, verb, object. It could be subject, object, verb. It could be verb, object, subject, verb, subject, object, object, subject, verb, object, verb, subject. But mathematically, there's 6 of these things. And all of these things are represented in languages in the world somewhere or other. However, some of them are a lot more common than others. So if you take this weird notion that the most common are the most human and the least common are the least human, then for Klingon, I should pick the least common, not because of any other reason than it's found in the fewest human languages. And the least common are these, the ones with the object first. And this one here is the one I chose for Klingon that's found in a few languages in the world, not very many, as the basic word order.
This language was in constant need of development, though, as actors struggled to pronounce certain words or reverted back to English sometimes. With the Klingons having a much more important role in the film, casting was crucial. Many auditioned for the role of Commander Krug, but few satisfied Nimoy or Bennett. An early frontrunner, however, was none other than Edward James Olmos, who would later go on to play William Adama in Battlestar Galactica, which was developed by Ronald D. Moore, who got his start on Star Trek The Next Generation and was known as the go-to Klingon guy, but now I'm getting ahead of myself. According to Nimoy, Olmos' audition tape was easily the best of the bunch. However, Harve Bennett had reservations about the actor's smaller than expected stature, as he had envisioned the character of Krug to be someone who could tower over Kirk. Nimoy believed Olmos could be made to appear much larger using simple camera tricks and other methods. The actor was asked to audition for the part a further 3 times. However, Nimoy couldn't convince Bennett or the Paramount executives Olmos was the right man for the role. It was after this Christopher Lloyd became interested in the role. At the time, Lloyd was most famous for his role on the sitcom Taxi, and was thought to be far too funny to convincingly portray a ruthless Klingon captain. Despite this perception of the actor, when Lloyd auditioned, Nimoy was apparently blown away by his performance. It was Nimoy who championed Lloyd to Harve Bennett. It took some time to convince the Paramount executives, though, who saw Lloyd simply as a funny TV actor, unaware of Lloyd's range. Having lost Olmos as his first choice, Nimoy stood his ground and eventually convinced them Lloyd was the right man for the job. Lloyd himself was quite surprised to be offered the part. He was aware of Star Trek as a pop culture presence and respected many of those involved in the project, but wasn't much of a Star Trek fan himself. Yet he was enthusiastic about taking on the character, although he did find the Klingon language quite a struggle.
So, wa, yechoch, kill one of them. One, imperative, kill. I don't care which one. Vai. That means somebody, anybody. Then I don't care. Jishachbe. J means I. Shach means to be concerned about. Bet means not. J means I. Shach means to be concerned about, to care about. Bet means not. So I don't care.
Yaho. Jeshachbe.
Yechoch. Jeshachbe. Leonard yells, cut. That was a great take. Christopher Lloyd says, I blew it. And he says, what do you mean? He says, I said the Klingon wrong. And he did. He left off the wa, and he left off the vai. Leonard Nimoy says, Mark, how did the Klingon sound to you? And I knew that the correct answer is, it sounded fine. And in fact, it did sound fine. It sounded like perfectly good Klingon. Grammatically, it wasn't what I had in mind, but it sounded fine. So what I did in order to make it work is just on the spot, change the grammar a little bit. And the main change I made was with this prefix, ye. Originally, ye meant this is an imperative, this is a command. But now you only use the ye prefix if you're giving a command and the object is singular. So yechoch has to mean kill one, because you use a different prefix, which I hadn't made up yet, if you mean kill more than one. So you don't need the wa. That's superfluous. That's extra. So suddenly what Christopher Lloyd said is grammatically just fine.
With the script having been completed, the projected budget of Star Trek III, now titled The Search for Spock, was $16 million. With many sets and costumes having already been built for the previous films, Star Trek III was able to splash out on more elaborate visual effects and give the film that epic scope which Nimoy wanted. For the designs of the film, Bennett once again stretched the budget, reusing past sets and costumes. The USS Grissom was once again just the same set as the Enterprise bridge, simply redressed with different chairs and displays. The Enterprise sickbay was also reused for the Klingon medical bay and the Earth set bar. The Klingon bridge set was actually made for a completely different science fiction production which never ended up being made, so it was procured for this movie. The costumes for the primary cast were also reused, with a few new costumes such as Starfleet security officers being adapted from other Enterprise crew costumes. The more significant designs for the film though are the new spaceships and a new starbase. The USS Excelsior was originally meant to be introduced in The Wrath of Khan and expected to be Sulu's new command, his presence on the Enterprise apparently just being a courtesy to Kirk. However, this thread was later dropped from The Wrath of Khan. ILM commissioned several artists who created dozens of possible designs for the new Excelsior. Model maker William George's design was the one that won out. He wanted to create a Starfleet vessel which was the clear technological superior to the Enterprise, something bolder and sleeker. He approached his drawing with the thought, what if the Japanese had designed the Enterprise? Nimoy picked George's design almost immediately. For the Klingon ship, ILM had started working from Bennett's original treatment in which the villains were still Romulans, and so went about crafting a new version of the Romulan bird of prey as seen in the original series. Nilo Rodis and Dave Carson were the primary designers of the ship, but it was Nimoy who inspired the winged silhouette, as he often made the shape with his hands during pre-production meetings. Rodis and Carson took this shape and came up with the idea of the bird of prey changing the orientation of its wings depending on its cruising or attack posture. William George also contributed to the design, suggesting the rounded shapes on top of the ship so it resembled the trapezius muscles of a bodybuilder, making the ship project more strength. The design for the bird of prey was well underway by the time the antagonists for the film were changed to Klingons rather than Romulans. The designers had even gone so far as to replicate the painted wings from the original Romulan bird of prey. Thus, the script reasoned that this was a Romulan ship which the Klingons had simply stolen. However, this thread was also later dropped from the finished film. The final significant new design was that of the Earth Space Dock, a massive orbiting space station which was said to be 3 kilometers in height, which was then later boosted to 5 kilometers. It has been noted that at this size, the station would actually be visible to the naked eye from Earth's surface. The same design and finished footage from The Search for Spock was later reused in subsequent Star Trek movies and TV shows. For the role of Saavik, the character was previously played by Kirstie Alley in The Wrath of Khan. However, Alley wasn't signed on for any more sequels at the time, and so when the time came for the follow-up film, Alley's agent attempted to negotiate a larger salary which Paramount was unwilling to meet. Thus, the part was recast, with Robin Curtis taking over the role. As mentioned before, security measures for the shoot were extreme. Almost all identifying plaques and signs were removed from any of the offices or workshops which could be connected to the production. Security guards were posted at every major entrance and exit, and ID badges were issued to all cast and crew. Spock's name was left out of all of the scripts, with the character instead being referred to as Naklov, which is Vulcan backwards. Specific typing errors and coloured pages were placed in each copy of the script in order to trace the sources of potential leaks. Filming took place almost entirely on Paramount Studios stages, with only 2 days of location shooting, something which somewhat irked director of photography Charles Correll, who wanted to shoot the Genesis planet sequences in Hawaii. Instead, the studio-based sets were extended using large matte paintings. Correll was able to shoot several sequences on 70mm film as opposed to 35mm, which would give the scenes a more lavish look to them, and allowed both cinematographer and director to be more experimental with their framing and lighting. Production of the film was briefly shut down though due to a fire which broke out at Paramount Studios due to arson. The fire destroyed several stages and threatened to destroy the enormous Genesis planet set. Many of the cast and crew, which included William Shatner, lended a hand in fighting the flames. Luckily, the set itself was undamaged, and thick black sheets were used to patch the holes in the studio walls. The visual effects were once again created by Industrial Light and Magic. Like before with The Wrath of Khan, every sequence was mapped out and storyboarded in advance before any models were built and any footage was shot. For the shots of the ship, ILM relied on their tried and true motion control camera system once again. A new effect was required for the Klingon cloaking device. At first the team devised a kind of X-ray effect, where layers of the ship would form from the inside out. However, this was deemed far too elaborate and not very logical, as the effect would take so long, enemy ships could simply blow the bird of prey out of the sky before it had finished decloaking. Instead, the effects supervisor decided on a simple off-color blurring, which proved to be more effective. For the interior Earth space dock scenes, massive interior miniatures were built to appropriately sell the scale. Despite their size, however, it still wasn't possible to actually place any of the ship models inside these sets. For the exterior model itself, the space dock was only 6 feet tall, which actually made it smaller than both the Enterprise and Excelsior models. The model was actually made of clear plexiglass, which was lit from within, and then painted silver. The hundreds of windows were created by model makers simply scraping away the paint in tiny rectangles to create the illusion of hundreds of different rooms with their own light source. The sequence which the VFX team looked forward to the most, though, was actually blowing up the Enterprise. At 10 feet long, the model was extremely cumbersome with complex internal lighting, which made it difficult and time-consuming to shoot with. While the effects supervisor wanted to take a mallet to this model, which cost over $150,000, several other specialized miniatures had to be created instead. First, a model of the bridge section was blown up, shot upside down to simulate zero gravity. Next, a styrofoam version of the registration number on the saucer section was created. An acid chemical was dropped onto the model from above to burn holes in the hull, which was then combined with the burning of steel wool from inside. Finally, the saucer explosion itself was yet another model which was composited onto the primary miniature. It was covered in a thick layer of talcum powder, so when the explosives detonated, it produced a massive cloud of debris. Harve Bennett knew fans would be expecting Spock to return, and so the destruction of the Enterprise was added to the script to give fans another shocking death, so to speak. Despite the strict security measures, however, this was still leaked to some fans. For the film's score, James Horner returned with the same theme reused. On several occasions, entire tracks from the Wrath of Khan score were reused for Star Trek 3, but Horner still composed a lot of great new material. The subtle, ethereal theme for Spock, first established in The Wrath of Khan, was brought back and expanded upon in The Search for Spock. This is a theme which plays throughout the movie, culminating in the destruction of the Genesis planet and the final restoration of Spock at the very end of the movie. For the Klingons, Horner didn't reuse Jerry Goldsmith's theme from the motion picture, but he mimicked its overall rhythm and style and blended it with similar sounds he used for Khan in the previous film. Just like with the previous production, thanks to Harve Bennett's cost-effective measures and good direction from Leonard Nimoy, Star Trek 3 finished on time and on budget. It was released on June 1st, 1984. Prevailing wisdom among some Trekkies is that the even-numbered Star Trek films are good and the odd-numbered films are bad. But even so, many of these same Trekkies seem to make an exception when it comes to The Search for Spock. Many acknowledge that while it is a step down from The Wrath of Khan, it's still an entertaining and well-made film, and I have to say I agree. A criticism which I had with The Wrath of Khan was its overall cheaper feel when compared to the motion picture, but this is remedied somewhat in The Search for Spock. Nimoy's goal of a grander, more operatic style certainly pays off, and the extra VFX budget doesn't go to waste either. Even though the scope of the plot is pretty much on the same level as The Wrath of Khan, it feels much larger in scale as a story. Charles Correll's cinematography is really outstanding, with some gorgeously shaped light and lots of atmosphere. While he may have wanted to do more location shooting, he no doubt succeeded in making the most out of the filming on stages. The VFX from ILM are just as good, if not improved, from The Wrath of Khan. It's really rare for ILM to ever turn in a bad shot, and this is no exception. Speaking purely from a nerdy point of view, The Search for Spock introduces some of my personal favourite ships and settings in the Star Trek universe. While the Bird of Prey may have been intended as a Romulan design, it fits right in with the Klingons of this era and has become a staple of that faction ever since. The Earth space dock is also wonderful. It's an elegant design and it feels truly colossal in size. The Excelsior is also one of my favourite Star Trek ships. It seems a lot larger and tougher than the Enterprise, yet simultaneously more sleek and advanced. It's just excellent work, and it always makes me smile to see this class of ship pop up in later Star Trek installments. Nimoy's direction isn't particularly flashy, and his construction of the scenes isn't quite as lean as Nicholas Meyer's approach, but he's clearly comfortable behind the camera as well as in front of it. His experience as an actor and working with this cast allows him to keep the focus of each plot beat on the characters, and he succeeds in bringing out some great performances from everyone. My biggest problem with The Search for Spock is that I kind of agree with Nicholas Meyer. It feels conceptually wrong to bring Spock back after the character was given such a beautiful send-off. I know it would have severely affected future Star Trek stories to leave Spock dead, but it just feels a bit redundant for the story to go in this direction. That being said, while in the moment there is a lot to like while watching the film, there are a number of terrific sequences and performances here. Christopher Lloyd is awesome as Commander Krug. He may not be what springs to mind as an actor when thinking of intimidating villains, but Nimoy was clearly correct in fighting for him to be cast. While Krug isn't on the same level of Khan in terms of villains, it's easy to see why the Klingons' popularity exploded after this film. The incorporation of their language and showcasing their moral code goes a long way in helping us understand the Klingons, even if we don't agree with their methods. In terms of emotional impact, the weak link in the film, I think, is David's death. It is quite ballsy to kill off Kirk's own son, and Kirk's reaction is brilliant acting from Shatner, but I feel like we, as an audience, never really got the chance to really invest in David as a character. He comes across as more of a plot device rather than a real person. It says something that the destruction of the Enterprise is actually far more heartbreaking than the death of David, but the build-up to its self-destruct and the way Krug figures out Kirk has outwitted him really pushes you to the edge of your seat, only to be knocked back again when the iconic vessel finally does explode. And as much as I think it was the wrong thing to do, it is truly lovely to see the two friends reunite with each other by the end. I think of the first 3 Star Trek movies, this is the weakest for me personally. It doesn't have the awe-inspiring visuals of the motion picture, or the rich themes of The Wrath of Khan, but it's still an entertaining Star Trek adventure with plenty of good thrills and humour. I can't give it a glowing recommendation, but overall, it gets a thumbs up from me. The critical and fan reception was overall quite similar, generally positive but not as well received as the previous outing. The box office for the film was strong once again. It grossed $87 million worldwide after its theatrical run and sold well once it hit home video. This showed to Paramount that The Wrath of Khan wasn't a fluke, and the creative team behind the franchise could continue to deliver. Among the cast and crew, they were very proud of their work on this one, but did take notice of some critics who felt that the Star Trek franchise was starting to show its age. Now, without Paramount looking over their shoulders, the creative duo of Leonard Nimoy and producer Harve Bennett were free to do something quite different. Before the release of The Search for Spock, Paramount was already very pleased with Nimoy's work as director, and so asked him to return for the following film. While he was under certain creative constraints for The Search for Spock, for Star Trek IV, they gave the director much greater creative freedom. Nimoy and Bennett both agreed their goal shouldn't be to repeat what had been done before with The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock. Rather than a drama-heavy space opera, they wanted to do a movie which was lighter in tone and without a primary villain for the story. Their initial concept was very different than what became The Voyage Home, due to William Shatner not wanting to reprise his role of Captain Kirk. He and his agent had entered into a salary dispute with Paramount during negotiations for the next installment, and by the time Nimoy and Bennett started conceiving of the next movie, this dispute didn't show any signs of resolution. Thus, Nimoy and Bennett's first idea was for a prequel movie following Kirk and Spock during their time at Starfleet Academy. However, when news of this concept reached fans, the reaction was extremely negative. Eventually, Shatner was able to reach a compromise with Paramount, signing on after a pay rise. Back during the run of the original series, Shatner's representation had drafted a favoured nations clause into his contract. This meant that any pay rise or perks received by Leonard Nimoy would also be received by Shatner and vice versa. Therefore, the increase in salary also translated to Nimoy. This salary dispute between cast and studio, as well as the rising costs of the feature film series in general, is what partly led to Paramount developing Star Trek The Next Generation, which debuted the year after Star Trek IV. Nimoy and Bennett's new concept was a time travel story, in which a problem arises which can only be fixed by retrieving something from the past. Various ideas were discussed, such as travelling back in time to retrieve the cure to a deadly plague. However, this was deemed too gruesome for the light-hearted tone they wanted. It was Nimoy who suggested the idea of retrieving humpback whales after he had read a book on extinct and endangered species. Nimoy was a passionate environmentalist, and the topic of whaling was a hot-button issue at the time. Thus, they created the idea of an alien probe arriving at Earth, sending signals which devastate advanced technology and disrupt the environment. These signals are eventually discovered to be intended for humpback whales, all of which are extinct by the 23rd century. Therefore, it's up to Captain Kirk and his crew to travel back in time and bring some humpback whales back into the 23rd century to make contact with the probe. During the writing process, Paramount was approached by Eddie Murphy, an enormous Star Trek fan, who asked for a role in the film. Fresh off the success of Beverly Hills Cop, Murphy was a big name at the time, and Paramount saw potential in attracting non-Star Trek fans to the fourth film by casting Murphy. Jeffrey Katzenberg described the idea as either the very best or worst idea in the world. The first draft of the script was written by Daniel Petrie Jr., who had penned Beverly Hills Cop. However, his draft wasn't well received and Paramount sought a new writer. Murphy also didn't like the character he was being offered and so decided to take the lead role in The Golden Child instead. The character offered to Murphy was then rewritten and turned into marine biologist Gillian Taylor, for whom Catherine Hicks was cast. Head of production Dawn Steele approached Nicholas Meyer, the writer and director of The Wrath of Khan, and requested he rewrite the current script. Although Meyer was repulsed by the idea of resurrecting Spock for the third film and refused to be involved in that project, by the time Star Trek IV entered development, he had cooled somewhat on the decision and agreed to write a new script for Star Trek IV. Meyer's debut feature Time After Time, which I highlighted in part 3 of this video series, similarly depicted characters out of time having to explore modern-day San Francisco. Meyer chose to have the Enterprise crew visit this same city when they returned to the past. Meyer, Bennett, and Nimoy all worked well together in crafting this new version, successfully injecting the sense of humour Nimoy was keen on. This resulted in scenes such as Spock using the Vulcan nerve pinch to knock out an obnoxious punk rocker playing his music too loud. This was inspired by a real anecdote in which Nimoy encountered a similar figure while queuing at a supermarket. He remembered thinking to himself, "If I could really do the Vulcan nerve pinch, I'd pinch his brains out." The writing process was a collaborative effort between Meyer and Bennett, who divided the task into separate portions. Bennett would write the first and third portions, which took place in the 23rd century, whereas Meyer would write the middle portion taking place in the modern day. After 12 days of writing, they would combine their portions and then do another draft to blend all three sections together smoothly. Nimoy said of Meyer's contribution to the script, "He gave the script the kind of humour and social comment, gadfly attitude I very much wanted. My vision was for no dying, no fighting, no shooting, no photon torpedoes, no phaser blasts, no stereotypical bad guy. I wanted people to really have a great time watching this film, and if somehow in the mix we lobbed a couple of big ideas at them, well, then that would be even better." After another round of rewrites and notes from William Shatner, the script was shown to Paramount executives, who were very pleased. For the production design, not much new was needed. Once again, thanks to Harve Bennett's cost-saving measures, many sets, props, and costumes were reused from previous films. However, the interior of the Klingon Bird of Prey was redesigned from the second-hand sets seen in The Search for Spock. Starships such as the USS Saratoga were redresses of the USS Reliant model, and the Earth Space Dock model was brought out of storage and retouched for new shots. The new design for the film was that of the alien probe created by the team at ILM. Concept artist Ralph McQuarrie faded in its design, with the team eventually settling on a simple cylinder with a small antenna jutting out from the bottom. 3 models were built at various different scales, the largest being 20 foot long. Originally the probe was covered in barnacles and painted ocean blue, but when looking back at the first few shots, the ILM team decided the probe didn't seem menacing enough, so they repainted the models black and reshot the sequences. Something else of note are some new graphical designs created for the movie by Michael Okuda, who would later create the LCARS menu system for Star Trek The Next Generation, among other contributions. In contrast to the search for Spock, which only had a single day of location shooting, the Voyage home had extensive location shooting around San Francisco and Los Angeles, among other places. For the fictional Cetacean Institute, which houses the 2 whales, Monterey Bay Aquarium in California was used, with the San Francisco skyline and larger water tank added in post. For the scenes taking place aboard the real-life nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, the crew used the non-nuclear-powered USS Ranger. This was because civilians are strictly forbidden from getting access to any nuclear-powered US Navy vessels. Scenes set on Vulcan were shot at the Vasquez Rocks, which were extensively used in the original series and are a staple of Star Trek locations, most recently appearing in Star Trek Picard, where they played themselves for the first time. Other shots around the Klingon bird of prey were shot at Paramount's backlot. The nature of the film's plot also required a large body of water, something which the production team found surprisingly hard to come by.
Years ago in Hollywood, most of the major studios had what they called a tank, a very large, oversized swimming pool was what it was, which they could do surface work and underwater photography work. And the tanks had either been closed up because they were no longer being used, or the ones that were still available were inadequate to our purposes for one reason or another. So we were kind of stymied for a while, until one day we were walking around out here in what is now a parking lot here at Paramount, and standing in front of this large blue screen, which was used as a background for some exterior scenes, and our special effects people noticed some seams in the ground around here, and went back to the original plans for the building of this studio, and discovered that the ground that I'm standing on is actually filled in and was a water tank about 15 feet deep years ago, and they used to use it for surface water battles and water scenes and underwater scenes and that sort of thing. And we discovered that we could do an excavation right here on the Paramount lot, and what grew out of that was a show, the kind of which Hollywood hasn't seen in a long time.
A thread originally deleted from the film before shooting, but retained in the novelization, is the reason for Saavik remaining on Vulcan. In the previous film, it is implied Saavik mates with the rapidly aging Spock during his ponfar. By the time of Star Trek IV, Saavik was originally said to be pregnant with Spock's child. However, this was deleted from the script before ever being shot. Although a lot of the production was location filming, some large sets were still built for the film in some important settings. First was the Federation Council chamber, first seen in this movie. As a cost-saving measure, production manager Jack T. Collis built the set with only one end. For the reverse angle, the podiums and various delegates simply switched sides rather than spending the time to do a new camera setup. This is a cost and time-saving measure more common than you may think, called cheating the turnaround. Another important set was that of Starfleet Command. To research for this location, Nimoy and Bennett visited the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory for inspiration. A notable piece of this set is a central table with some screens and monitors on it, which was nicknamed the pool table. This piece was later used as the control desk in engineering for Star Trek The Next Generation. For the visual effects, ILM had a much lighter workload when it came to outer space sequences. Many starship shots involving the Bird of Prey, USS Saratoga, and Earth Space Dock relied on motion-controlled camera shots, various elements being shot with a camera programmed to follow a specific path and then composited together.
The shot where the Bird of Prey comes in under the Golden Gate Bridge, and they had built a large forced perspective miniature of the bridge, and they basically had it out in the parking lot behind what we called UJ building.
We had it in our back lot, a little miniature of the bridge, and we were piling in a bunch of fog and smoke, and we had basically a miniature lake that we'd created. And what they were trying to do was have the Bird of Prey come flying underneath the bridge,
And for the longest time, they were attempting to get the bird of prey as a practical. They were trying to put the model on a wire rig and fly it through there and get the shot. And it just was complicated for a variety of reasons.
The timings and the look, especially with the smoke coming through and everything, was just, it was just a very tough shot.
So in the end, ultimately that shot was a composite where the bird of prey was shot as a motion control element.
And it's really difficult to take a miniature and fly it through a scene and shoot it live action wise. So we decided just to use the bridge aspect. The background looked beautiful, and then I ended up in motion control doing the bird of prey, just sneaking under that bridge and flying by camera. And it's another one of the shots that I'm very proud of, and I felt like, boy, this will be kind of a signature shot, and I think it was.
An ambitious scene in the film was the dreamlike sequence experienced by Kirk and the crew when they begin time traveling. This involved painting the entire Klingon bridge set white for the start of the sequence, but the most difficult portions were those created using computer graphics. A 3D scanning technology developed by a company called Cyberware was used to scan the heads of the actors. These 3D scans were then animated and morphed into one another for the final shot. These 30 seconds in the film took 2 weeks to fully render. The most challenging aspect of the film's visual effects was creating the whales themselves. There was very little in the way of usable stock footage available for the film, so ILM was tasked with devising a way to create whales for the film. After some trial and error, they created a total of 4 radio-controlled model whales roughly 4 foot long. They traveled to Serra High School in San Mateo, California, and used their swimming pool to shoot the sequences with the model whales. A large team of technicians and operators completed the shots in 2 weeks. In addition to this, the team built large, full-scale animatronics for certain scenes, such as a tail, upper fin, and eye. When the film eventually debuted, Paramount came under immense scrutiny from animal rights groups. The effects were so convincing, these groups assumed the production team had used real whales and were concerned how close the cast and crew had gotten to them while shooting. Nimoy and Paramount executives remedied the situation by inviting representatives of these groups to their facilities to show them how the whales were brought to life. For the film's score, composer James Horner wasn't available to return, so Nimoy hired Leonard Rosenman, who had composed the score for Nicholas Meyer's first film Time After Time, among other films such as the fantastic Voyage and the animated Lord of the Rings movie. He originally wanted to do a reorchestration of Alexander Courage's theme from the original series, but Nimoy requested an original piece instead. Elsewhere in the score though, he did bring back the original theme for the reappearance of the Enterprise. He took heavy inspiration from Russian classical composers to inject a bright playfulness to the action, particularly Chekhov's escape from the USS Enterprise. For more contemporary music, Rosenman collaborated with the jazz fusion group the Yellow Jackets for cues in San Francisco and other cues around the whales. The result is a score quite different from the previous Trek films, and remains something of an oddity within the musical history of the franchise. Once again, thanks to the cost-efficient running of the production and Nimoy's strong direction, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home was completed on time on a budget of $21 million. It was released on the 26th of November, 1986. Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home is a movie I have truly mixed feelings about as a fan of Star Trek. It's undeniably a fun romp and exactly the light-hearted, enjoyable caper Nimoy wanted it to be, but it's never been one of my go-to Star Trek movies. Nimoy's classical and economical direction carries over to this movie with an emphasis away from flashy camera moves or striking compositions, and instead on robust pacing, character, and performance. Due to the contemporary setting, it doesn't look as spectacular as The Search for Spock, but the extensive location shooting lends the film a realism and gravity to the events. Rather than the stagey, operatic tone of Star Trek III, this one feels much more down to earth. Although that's not to say there aren't some terrific visual effects sequences throughout the film. Once again, ILM's work is truly exceptional. The mysterious probe is extremely memorable as an antagonistic force. Not evil, of course, but the sound design, visuals, and sheer scale of this thing make it really menacing. And with each Star Trek movie, the spaceship and space station shots just seem to get better and better. The really impressive achievement, however, are the whales themselves. they look completely real. While there is some stock footage of real whales here and there, it's estimated about 90% of the shots use either the radio-controlled whale models or the full-scale animatronics, and as a viewer you simply cannot tell. It's hardly surprising that various animal rights groups were up in arms, because even now I don't question for a second if these things are real. It's easily some of the best practical effects work done in movie history, and it's likely because they're so convincing they actually don't often come up on those great practical effects lists you sometimes see on the internet. Leonard Rosenman's score for the film truly does feel like the odd one out when it comes to Star Trek music. It's a totally different flavour to the sweeping symphonies of Jerry Goldsmith and the swashbuckling style of James Horner. That being said though, it's still a really good score in its own right. The new main theme is really memorable, the action cues throughout are so playful and enjoyable to listen to, but Rosenman still manages to inject plenty of drama into the film when he needs to, and I really like the brief rendition of the original series theme at the end. It's short, but it's very nice. The humour for the film is delightful, with so many quotable lines which have become memes in Star Trek fandom today. I also appreciate how much more the supporting cast actually have to do in this movie. Traditionally, the emphasis is placed on Kirk, Spock and McCoy, with Chekhov, Uhura, Sulu and Scotty mostly being relegated to technobabble or ship function dialogue. But here, by splitting the crew off into different plot threads, many of those great lines and fun scenes are led by these characters, and it's really welcome. Catherine Hicks is also great in the film. While many of the most famous quotes come from the established cast, the dialogue for Gillian Taylor is super charming, and Hicks gives a very endearing performance. My main issue with The Voyage Home is that it's simply not the kind of Star Trek I prefer. This is where the creative intentions of the filmmakers clash with my own personal taste. I much prefer the outer space adventure and space opera sides of the Star Trek franchise, and often find myself instinctively favouring the motion picture The Wrath of Khan or The Search for Spock over this one. That's not to say I dislike The Voyage Home, not at all. It's a delightfully enjoyable movie, but perhaps the premise of a Star Trek crew travelling back to the modern day has been done a little too often for it to be really something special anymore. I know this movie is often ranked quite highly by a lot of Trekkies, and I totally see why. Every time I rewatch it, I have a blast, but for me, it's not one I place near the top of my list. It's kind of a funny conclusion to present as a review, I know. After all, the film achieves everything it sets out to do, and in terrific fashion. But it's not a movie which has had a particularly strong impact on me as a Star Trek fan. It may not be what I prefer when it comes to Star Trek, but I'm always happy to watch it, and I'm happy it's loved by so many others. Upon release, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home was met with box office success and critical praise. It more than doubled the opening week of The Search for Spock, and went on to gross $133 million worldwide, coming close to matching the gross of the motion picture. However, thanks to The Voyage Home's lower budget and strong home video sales, Star Trek IV became the most profitable film in the franchise at that point. The film attracted many general filmgoers as well as long-time Star Trek fans. Critics praised its refreshing change of direction and light-hearted tone. Particular praise was given to the sense of humour and the performances from the cast. The film frequently appears near the top of many Trekkies' personal rankings and is regarded as one of the strongest entries in the film series to this day. Of the two Star Trek movies he directed, Nimoy named The Voyage Home as his personal favourite. And it seemed fitting to end on such a high, so to speak. By end, I refer to the often named Star Trek trilogy of The Wrath of Khan, The Search for Spock, and The Voyage Home. With the crew restored to the Enterprise, and all the lingering plot threads wrapped up in this installment, this was effectively the completion of a multi-part arc. Producer Harve Bennett, having worked tirelessly on the movies for 7 years by this point, considered stepping away from the franchise to work on new things. However, back when production of Star Trek IV was commencing, William Shatner expressed an interest in directing a Star Trek movie himself. Due to the aforementioned favoured nations clause in his contract, Shatner was technically owed a chance at directing thanks to Nimoy being given the big chair. The result was certainly one of the most memorable Star Trek adventures, for better or for worse. As stated in the previous video of this series, back during the original series, William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy had secured a favoured nations clause in their contracts. This meant that for all Star Trek related projects, any perks such as a pay rise or script control which one of the actors received, so would the other and vice versa. With Nimoy having directed the previous 2 Star Trek movies, Paramount was obliged to offer the same opportunity to William Shatner. While negotiating to reprise the role of Captain Kirk in Star Trek IV, Shatner was promised the chance to direct the next film and help craft its story. Shatner's primary inspiration for his story were televangelists, who Shatner found repulsive and horrifying, but also deeply fascinating. He saw them as shameless exploiters, getting rich off the back of those genuinely seeking help. This led to Shatner creating a character named Czar, the leader of a cult-like group who could control others with telepathic abilities, searching the cosmos for God. In Shatner's original outline, the Enterprise would be overwhelmed by Czar's superior forces, with everyone coming to believe in Czar's quest, except Kirk, who would fake his belief in order to remain on the Enterprise in the hopes of freeing his crew. The journey would take them to a fiery waste of a planet, where an entity appears to them as God, but when questioned, this entity would transform into a satanic-like figure, who Kirk would have to outwit to save his friends. Producer Harve Bennett, who had been working on the Star Trek feature films for 7 years by this point, was exhausted by the demanding productions and wanted to move on to other projects. However, following a lengthy discussion with Shatner, he agreed to return for Star Trek V. Bennett raised several issues with Shatner's outline, particularly with the ending of the film. He felt no on-screen depiction of God could ever satisfy audience expectations, and suggested changing the entity to an alien being pretending to be God. Gene Roddenberry disliked the entire idea of the characters searching for God, especially a God as depicted by Western religions. By this point, Roddenberry was a famously outspoken atheist whose vision of the future didn't include organized religion of any kind. Roddenberry, along with Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley, also objected to the idea of Spock and McCoy betraying Kirk and siding with Czar. To revise the treatment and write the script, Bennett and Shatner approached Wrath of Khan writer-director Nicholas Meyer, but he was unavailable at the time. Eventually, David Lowery was hired as writer. However, a writer's strike delayed Lowery turning in his first draft, and when Nimoy had to leave to work on another project, production was delayed even further. The revised scripts changed Czar's name to Sybok and overall made the character much more sympathetic. Paramount also grew concerned about the film going over budget due to the film's climax, which involved an epic battle featuring angels and demons. To rein in the scope, these angels and demons were changed to rock monsters which the god entity would animate from the ground. At first the sequence featured 6 of these monsters, but eventually it was reduced to just 1. During this struggle to nail down a script which satisfied everyone, Paramount execs became concerned about losing the momentum generated by Star Trek IV, and so rushed the film into pre-production, despite having lost time due to the writer's strike. Initially, George Takei didn't want to reprise his role as Sulu. He and Shatner had a famously antagonistic relationship over the years, and Takei didn't want to be directed by Shatner. However, he was eventually convinced to return, and to his surprise, had a pleasant time making the film, as did many others. Despite his flaws, Shatner's ability to maintain a high energy level and passion while working put most of the cast and crew in good spirits, despite the behind-the-scenes pressure. For the role of Sybok, Shatner and Paramount executives wanted Sean Connery for the part. In fact, the planet Shakari, where the god entity is found in the script, was named after the actor. However, they were unable to meet his salary demands. Shatner later recommended Lawrence Luckinbill after seeing his PBS one-man stage show of Lyndon Johnson. Luckinbill is in fact the son-in-law of Lucille Ball, co-owner of Desilu Productions, which produced Star Trek the original series, and he is also uncle to the Wachowskis, who created The Matrix. For a trio of human, Romulan, and Klingon diplomats on the ruined outpost Paradise, David Warner, Cynthia Gao, and Charles Cooper were cast. David Warner would later play Chancellor Gorkon in Star Trek VI, as well as Gul Madred in Star Trek The Next Generation's Chain of Command. Cooper would also appear in Star Trek The Next Generation as Klingon Chancellor Kempek. For the other new Klingon characters in the film, stuntman Todd Bryant, who had also worked with Shatner on T.J. Hooker, was cast as Commander Kla. Actress and bodybuilder Spice Williams was cast as Kla's first officer, Vixis. For the role of God, George Murdoch was cast. He would also appear in The Next Generation as Admiral Hansen. For the film's art direction and production design, Shatner worked with art director Nilo Rodis and production designer Herman Zimmerman. Shatner wanted a more grounded, grittier look to the film, and worked well with Rodis in conceiving the overall look of the movie. Shatner also wanted to design new Starfleet uniforms, but budget constraints prevented this, although Rodas did design new brown field uniforms and larger phasers. Herman Zimmerman created a new bridge design for the Enterprise A. At the end of Star Trek IV, the bridge of the Enterprise A was a repaint of the same bridge set used from the previous Star Trek movies. This new set featured far more light and graphics, designed once again by Michael Okuda. Zimmerman also designed a new Klingon Bird of Prey set and the Paradise City set. A handful of sets from Star Trek The Next Generation were also used in the film, such as corridor sets and sickbay. Filming commenced in October 1988 and immediately ran into trouble from industrial action, specifically union truck drivers, who went on strike, preventing the essential filming equipment making it to location. There was such bad blood between the drivers and the production, one of the filming trucks exploded from possible sabotage. Eventually, non-union drivers were found who moved the trucks late at night to Yosemite National Park to begin filming. For the opening sequence, a wooden replica of the El Capitan rock face was built at a parking lot overlooking the park, which Shatner climbed up. Leonard Nimoy was stood on a crane arm to simulate Spock levitating thanks to his rocket boots. After Yosemite, filming moved to the Mojave Desert to shoot the Nimbus 3 and Shakari scenes. Filming in the extreme heat took a toll on many cast and crew, with exhaustion setting in quickly. The harsh conditions also led to frayed tempers and the occasional shouting match. By the time filming moved back to Paramount Studios, the general mood improved and production quickly moved ahead of schedule. As well as these spacecraft interior sets, several exteriors were also created. A stand-in set was created for Shakari for scenes which would be intercut with location footage. While filming, the crew attempted to execute the rock monster effect as described in the script, with a practical suit being built around a stunt performer. The inner workings of the suit were complex, allowing the monster to breathe fire on command. However, these mechanics broke down during filming, and few were happy with the resulting footage. Shatner said, "Our guy in a silly rubber suit ultimately just looked like, well, a guy in a silly rubber suit." The monster, dubbed Rockman, was cut from the film, and the climax had to be hastily rewritten and edited. The final scenes to be shot were the campfire scenes. Soon after the wrap party, a press conference was called, attended by all the principal cast on the Enterprise bridge set. Soon after, Shatner went on to tackle the post-production work. For the film's visual effects, Industrial Light and Magic, which had handled the effects in Star Trek II, were unavailable as they were busy working on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, as well as Ghostbusters 2. After shopping the film around to various visual effects studios, Paramount hired Associates and Ferron, headed by Brad Ferron. But to create the visual effects, the tight schedule only allowed for 3 months for Ferron to do the work, around half the usual time frame. Rather than the motion-controlled camera techniques used by ILM, Ferron used rear projection techniques to try and capture as many elements in camera as possible. Despite their cost-saving attempts, the VFX budget was much higher than anticipated, and so several shots had to be cut. To replace the original rock monster sequence, Brad Ferron proposed an amorphous blob of light which could chase Kirk. Shatner was very disappointed by the resulting shots, but Paramount wasn't able to spend the money needed to reshoot, and so the shots were left as they were. Overall, it became evident Associates and Ferron didn't have the resources to handle the work, and the tight schedule and budget only exacerbated these problems. For the film's score, Jerry Goldsmith returned, having previously composed the Oscar-nominated score for the motion picture. For Star Trek V, Goldsmith was keen to write some more action-oriented cues, which were largely absent from the motion picture. Goldsmith brought back the theme from the motion picture, this time combined with the opening from Alexander Courage's original series theme. Goldsmith also brought back the Klingon theme from the motion picture, albeit with a different tempo and a ram's horn added in. By the 80s, Goldsmith regularly experimented with synthesizers and used them several times in the Star Trek V score. A leitmotif for Sybok in particular leans heavily on synthesized sounds. In general, Goldsmith's score for Star Trek V was much wider in scope, with a larger amount of leitmotifs as opposed to the two primary theme structure of the motion picture. For the film's edit, Shatner had a hard time building a new ending for the film, as well as integrating the controversial visual effects shots. At the same time, Paramount demanded a runtime of approximately 1 hour 45 minutes, whereas Shatner pushed for a 2-hour runtime. Early test screenings for the film garnered a poor reception, and so quick reshoots, rewrites, and harsh edits were made before the film was received more positively. The production had been plagued with problems, but on the 9th of June 1989, Star Trek V: The Final Frontier made its debut. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier is often named as the worst of the franchise's big screen outings, and unfortunately it's easy to see why. Its rushed production and cobbled together edit are clearly reflected in the end product. The plot never quite comes together in a cohesive way, and the pacing feels off from the start. There are many interesting ideas in the film, but none of them are given the time or attention to really be explored in any depth. Ultimately, the audience is left with far more questions than answers. We never get a satisfying answer to what this god entity actually is, and the quest to reach the fabled Shakari feels like it ended before it even began. The Great Barrier at the center of the galaxy, for example, is traversed without so much as a console sparking. That's not to say there's nothing to like here. Shatner generally does a pretty decent job as a director, and DOP Andrew Laszlo's work gives the film that more grounded feel Shatner was going for. There's great use of shadows and darkness to shape each shot. There are also moments of great acting from the regular cast, in particular DeForest Kelley when Sybok exposes McCoy's guilt over euthanizing his own father. Luckenbill himself is a strong antagonist as Sybok. He really nails that cult of personality, and you believe others would follow him on his quest. What's disappointing though is the revelation of Sybok being Spock's half-brother. Not because the concept itself is bad, but nothing much is done with it in the actual film. Nimoy and Luckenbill don't really share much interesting dialogue. As a result, Sybok being Spock's half-brother doesn't amount to anything. Jerry Goldsmith's score for the film is fantastic, but then again his work is always strong. I've said before his theme for the motion picture is what I tend to think of as the Star Trek theme, and The Final Frontier's new rendition of it is terrific. The synthesizers really add a lot of texture to the score, and the action cues are top notch. Honestly, the theme he introduces after the opening march and then uses later for Shakari is one of the most beautiful tracks I've ever heard in a film, just excellent work all around. The visual effects though really do suffer. Whether it's to be blamed on incompetence or lack of time/money, the shots were largely subpar for the time and haven't aged well at all. The quality of the optical work is all over the place, with several elements looking either hand-drawn or stop-motion animated, despite being shot with actual miniatures. The colours often look very washed out and flat, and the same goes for the general compositions as well. There's a lack of dynamism to the movement, with most ships just going from one side of the screen to the other without any kind of interesting camera moves. Whenever the film reuses some of ILM's work from the previous films, the difference is night and day. I don't think Star Trek V is an unpleasant viewing experience, but it's certainly an odd one. There's an attempt to recapture the humour of Star Trek IV, but more often than not it comes across as cringy and out of place rather than charming. Uhura's feather dance and Kirk wrestling with a triple-breasted Catwoman are just kind of baffling. I think the biggest problem with the film is Shatner trying to recapture the kinds of adventures featured in the original series, despite the franchise having moved beyond that kind of style. The cast are noticeably much older, yet Kirk begins the film free-climbing El Capitan as if he's some kind of prime athlete, not to mention other haphazardly staged action sequences throughout, which aren't very convincing.
Captain's log, stardate 6051. Had trouble sleeping last night. My hiatal hernia is acting up. The ship is drafty and damp. I complain, but nobody listens.
Star Trek 12. So very tired.
The previous 3 Trek films made efforts to really progress these characters and have them grow, whereas Star Trek V tries to carry on like business as usual. In a way it reminds me of A View to a Kill, where Roger Moore was blatantly too old for the role of James Bond by that point. The strange juxtaposition of these elements actually made it worthy of being the subject of the Watch Party series on another channel of mine, similar to what we did with Spock's brain, which I mentioned back in part 1 of this series.
Oh, Huda, I thought you were on leave.
I thought you were retired. Huda, I thought you were dead. I was at someone's funeral.
While there are bits to be liked in this film, it's easily the weakest of the first 6 films. Personally, it isn't my least favourite of the Star Trek movies in general, but I understand why so many fans rank it at the bottom. It's poorly plotted, strangely paced, and full of real head-scratchers. That being said, I don't think it's anywhere near the kind of atrocity it's sometimes made out to be. I can find some entertainment while watching, even if it is simply to laugh at the film rather than laugh with it. The soundtrack is excellent and there are some great character moments sprinkled in here and there. But overall, I think most would agree The Final Frontier was a real low point for Star Trek on the big screen. Upon release, The Final Frontier was met with mixed to negative reviews from critics and a similarly poor reception from fans. While the performances of the cast were praised, many criticised the messy script and lower than expected production values. Reflecting on the film, many of the cast and crew share the low opinion of the movie. Shatner himself later called it a failed but glorious attempt at a thought-provoking film that didn't come together. Equally disappointing was the film's box office performance. While it did debut at number 1 with an opening weekend larger than any previous Star Trek film, The Final Frontier finished its theatrical run with only $63 million worldwide, on a budget of $33 million. While it did sell well on home video, this gross fell well short of analyst expectations, some of which were as high as $200 million. Part of this can be blamed on the summer release date, which put the film in competition with anticipated hits, like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Ghostbusters 2, Lethal Weapon 2, License to Kill, and Batman. At the time of the film's release, Star Trek The Next Generation had also started its run, and Harve Bennett believed this dampened enthusiasm for a Star Trek movie. Collectively, all those involved with the making of the film expressed regret and disappointed over the conception, production, and release, with many believing they had played a part in killing the movie series. But Harve Bennett, a producer on the film series since The Wrath of Khan, felt it was necessary for there to be another big screen outing for Star Trek's 25th anniversary in 1991. Once again, Star Trek had stumbled, but just as it had done before, the movies had a chance to soar one last time. Although Harve Bennett was the one who pushed for another big screen installment, his idea was a radical departure from the previous films. He revisited an idea Ralph Winter had for Star Trek IV, a prequel which would tell the story of how Kirk, Spock, and McCoy first met at Starfleet Academy. Bennett proposed a framing device where DeForest Kelley as Dr. McCoy would tell the story to a class of Academy graduates. The flashback story would then feature younger actors playing the famous characters in what Bennett described as a pre-Enlightenment Federation. This Federation would be extremely flawed, with prejudice against aliens as a prominent part of the story. Bennett's treatment also featured James Kirk's father, who goes missing during a warp drive experiment partly overseen by Montgomery Scott. The climax to the treatment would see the familiar crew come together to defeat a new villain of some kind. Paramount executives demanded Bennett find some way to include William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy in the film. Bennett obliged, adding them to the framing story, but his second draft was also rejected. Allegedly, Paramount chief Fred Mancuso blamed Bennett for the failure of Star Trek V and wanted someone else to create the story for Star Trek VI. In my opinion, this is extremely unfair on Bennett, whose tireless efforts and outsider approach to Star Trek helped rejuvenate the franchise and delivered many successful films. While his idea for an Academy Year's story may not have been right for the time, we've seen how successful a similar idea can be with the characters. Unfortunately, after years of hard work on the film series, Bennett decided to call it a day. He left the project and left the Star Trek franchise for good. Actor Walter Koenig suggested his own idea, which he codenamed Flanders Fields. In his story, the Romulan Empire joins forces with the Federation to go to war with the Klingon Empire. The regular crew of the Enterprise, with the exception of Spock, are forced into retirement after being deemed obsolete. When Spock and his new crew are captured by mysterious worm-like alien creatures, the retired crew have to whip themselves back into shape and rescue them. By the end of the story, all main characters except Spock and McCoy are killed off. Eventually, Mancuso asked Leonard Nimoy to come up with a new story for the sixth film, which was to be a swan song for the original cast. While Nimoy worked to devise his idea, Nicholas Meyer was also asked to come up with a story premise, but Meyer confessed he had nothing. Eventually, Nimoy and Meyer both sat down in a meeting, and it was there Nimoy suggested, "What if the wall comes down in space?" You know, the Klingons have always been our stand-ins for the Russians. Meyer later recalled being immediately captivated by the idea, enthusiastically replying to Nimoy, "Oh, wait a minute, Okay, we start with an intergalactic Chernobyl. Big explosion, we got no more Klingon Empire. From there, the entire story simply spilled out of Meyer. Meyer deliberately included references to contemporary politics. After all, the same year Star Trek V was released, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was on its last legs. Meyer envisaged the character of Chancellor Gorkon, whom he likened to Mikhail Gorbachev, but also drew from Anwar Sadat, Mahatma Gandhi, and Abraham Lincoln for inspiration. On the eve of peace between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, Gorkon would be shockingly assassinated and the blame placed on Captain Kirk and his crew. While Kirk and McCoy are imprisoned by the Klingons, Spock and the rest of the crew would work to uncover the truth and avert potential disaster. While Meyer worked on the script with his friend Denry Martin Finn, Meyer's wife suggested he direct the film as well. This hadn't occurred to Meyer, but Nimoy and Paramount were supportive of the idea. Because of the favoured nations clause in Nimoy and Shatner's contracts, if Nimoy directed another Star Trek film, Paramount could potentially be drawn into a dispute with Shatner's agency. Hiring Meyer avoided this, and so Meyer signed on to direct his second Star Trek film. The writing process was a tough one, with Meyer and Finn constantly haggling with Paramount execs over budget constraints and with the cast over character notes. A protracted sequence at the start of the film in which various members of the crew were all recruited one by one for the mission had to be removed. Eventually, the script was finished by October of 1990. The film was given the title The Undiscovered Country in reference to a Shakespeare quote spoken in the film, and was one of the unused titles for The Wrath of Khan. Gene Roddenberry, still maintaining his ceremonial position as creative consultant, hated the finished script. Just as with The Wrath of Khan, Roddenberry felt Meyer's approach to Star Trek was far too militaristic and objected to Kirk expressing strong prejudice toward Klingons among a mountain of other issues. Roddenberry and Meyer had a famously antagonistic relationship since their meetings during The Wrath of Khan, and the meetings for Star Trek VI were even worse. During the first meeting, Nicholas Meyer stormed out of the room after only 5 minutes. Meyer especially objected to Roddenberry giving notes on the character of Saavik, who in early drafts was set to return. Meyer said, "I created Saavik. She was not Gene's. If he doesn't like what I plan on doing with her, maybe he should give back the money he's made off my films. Maybe then I'll care what he has to say." Tragically, Gene Roddenberry died soon after these meetings took place, and Meyer has since expressed deep regret concerning his behaviour. It was Meyer who suggested dedicating the film to Roddenberry's memory. In Meyer's initial drafts, Saavik would be revealed as part of the conspiracy to spark continuing war between the Federation and Klingons. Originally, Meyer wanted Kirstie Alley to reprise the role, but she proved unavailable due to her commitments to shooting Cheers. Robin Curtis was unfortunately not asked. Therefore, Saavik was instead changed to a new character, Valeris, for whom Kim Cattrall was cast. For the production design of the film, Meyer worked closely with director of photography Hiro Narita to modernize the look of Star Trek and do something visually distinct from The Wrath of Khan. Narita was under constant time and budget constraints, but was generally successful in achieving the look he wanted, that of a more darkly lit style, avoiding the bright, stagey look of some previous Star Trek films. Herman Zimmerman returned to serve as production designer, creating new interiors for the Klingon battlecruiser Kronos 1. The bridge of the Enterprise was a much more difficult task. Although the sets from Star Trek V had been sent to storage, while it was temporarily placed in a parking lot, a freak weather accident destroyed the entire set, save for a few pieces. Beyond salvage, a new bridge set needed to be built from scratch, which could also pull double duty as the Excelsior Bridge. But Meyer ran into trouble with Paramount executive David Kirkpatrick, whose strict control of the budget simply would not allow the building of a new set. Obviously, Meyer was incensed, as this set was crucial to the film. The standoff became so bad that at one point Kirkpatrick ordered Star Trek VI be cancelled altogether. However, a few weeks later, Paramount president Stanley Jaffe, who had taken over from Mancuso by that point, understood Meyer's request for additional funding, and the film was put back into production. The bridge of the Enterprise was modified somewhat. Much of the carpet used in Star Trek V was removed. Zimmerman also added console extensions to Spock and Uhura's stations, so they didn't have to be constantly facing the wall and could more easily talk to the other crew members. As part of the cost-saving measures of the production, many sets from previous movies were reused, as well as sets from Star Trek The Next Generation. The dining room, for example, was a redress of the Enterprise D briefing room. Spock's quarters were a redress of Data's quarters, although they were also a redress of Kirk's quarters from The Wrath of Khan. The Federation President's office was a redress of the 10 Forward set. The transporter set also came from TNG with a control booth constructed around the main console, and Deanna Troy's office was modified into the ship's galley. The corridor sets were also reused, however Meyer insisted on making them darker and more claustrophobic to better echo the submarine feeling, which he felt was much more dramatic. For the new Klingon characters, several notable additions joined the film's cast. Rosanna de Soto was cast as Gorgon's daughter, Azit Burr, while for Gorkon himself, David Warner made his second appearance in the Star Trek franchise as the character. For the villainous General Chang, the late great Christopher Plummer was cast. Nicholas Meyer was an enormous fan of the actor's work, and wrote the role specifically with him in mind. Plummer's famed Shakespeare work was why Meyer included the Shakespeare quotes in Chang's dialogue. While being a fan of the original series, Plummer was apprehensive about taking on the role as he was not enthusiastic about being buried under Klingon makeup. Initially, he turned the part down, but after subsequent phone calls from Meyer and Nimoy, the actor was assured his makeup would be different and therefore easier to work in. Plummer was enthusiastic about working alongside William Shatner. The two had known each other for quite some time and had a friendly rivalry ever since Shatner worked as Plummer's understudy for a stage production of Hamlet in the 1950s.
Did he upstage you once when you were sick?
Yes, it was in 1956, Michael Langham's production of Henry V. And I suddenly got, oh God, I got this awful pain in my tummy, and I thought, Christ, it's syphilis.
Why did you think syphilis? Why didn't you think food poisoning?
Don't ask me that.
Okay.
But it wasn't. It wasn't, was it? So I went to the hospital and they filled me with morphine. It was a kidney stone that had to be removed, and God, they're painful, unbelievable. But halfway through the evening, I came out of the morphine stuff, and I started wandering down the corridors of the hospital. And the nurse stopped me and said, "Where do you think you're going?" I said, I've got a performance tonight. And she said, "No, you haven't. You're going right back to your little bed." And she took me back to bed, and I was convinced I was going to do it. Yeah. But Bill Shatner was my understudy, so he went on as Henry V. And what he did was he didn't do what I did at all. Mm-hmm. When I stood up to make a speech, he would sit down and do his speech.
He did the opposite of you.
He did the opposite of everything I did, and I knew that son of a was going to be a star.
Once cast, Plummer enjoyed the part, taking particular care with his Klingon dialogue. Originally, the Klingon language inventor Mark Okrand came up with the famous to be or not to be translation as, forgive my poor Klingon here, yin pach, yin bech. However, Plummer didn't like the way this phrase sounded and wanted something a little punchier. Okrand instead came up with tach pa, tach be, and Plummer gave this his thumbs up. Another minor Klingon character was the Klingon defense attorney, played by Michael Dorn. Meyer and Nimoy told the actor he was playing the grandfather of his Next Generation character Worf. René Aubergenois was cast in the role of Colonel West. Although his scene was later cut from the theatrical release, his character does appear in the home video release. Aubergenois would later play Odo in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. For the role of Martia, a prisoner on Rura Penthe who helps Kirk and Bones escape, supermodel Iman was cast. The role of the Federation President was played by Kurtwood Smith, who was working with Meyer on the film Company Business when Meyer got the call regarding Star Trek VI. Grace Lee Whitney, who played Janice Rand early in the original series, had made a handful of cameos in previous Star Trek movies, and was given another as Excelsior's communications officer. A more bizarre cameo in the film is that of Christian Slater. The actor was an enormous Star Trek fan and begged his mother, who worked as the film's casting director, for a part in the movie. Allegedly, he was so happy to appear in the film, he kept his Starfleet uniform afterwards. Filming began on the 16th of April 1991 on a number of fixed sets and locations. Because of the strict budget control and lack of studio space, the shooting schedule and script were in constant need of revision. However, Meyer was good at thinking on his feet, and often said, "Art thrives on restrictions." To this end, the film was shot in Super 35 rather than anamorphic lenses because of its greater flexibility. Meyer and Narita borrowed techniques from Citizen Kane, such as letting sets fall into darkness. This meant deliberately not lighting the edges of the set to save on construction costs. For the dinner scene, the prepared food was dyed blue and purple to appear more alien, but this resulted in the actors not wanting to eat the meals. To get around this, Meyer offered a $20 bounty for any shot captured of the actors actually eating their food. Apparently William Shatner assisted in collecting these bounties by eating an entire purple-dyed squid. For the courtroom scene, a forced perspective miniature of the set was created to cheat the size of the room. The miniature was filled with over 60 Klingon action figures who were moved around using sticks. For the Rura Pente scenes, a second unit was sent to Alaska to shoot doubles of Shatner and DeForest Kelley walking across a glacier. The close-up shots of the actors were filmed later on a soundstage. For the actual prison, abandoned mining caves at Griffith Park in California were used, filming at night to give the illusion of being underground. The scenes for the final battle of the film were shot later in the schedule, as the sequence necessitated blowing up several pieces, and the tight budget would make it difficult to repair them. Meyer arranged for the last scene to be shot to be the last scene of the movie, when the Enterprise goes off on one last flight. Originally the dialogue was much more somber, but Meyer made some last-minute rewrites for a more optimistic tone, integrating a quote from Peter Pan as Kirk's final line. Emotions ran high as the final take finished. The cast and crew raised a glass of champagne in celebration, with some of them holding back tears. For the visual effects, Paramount made sure not to repeat the mistakes of Star Trek V, and Industrial Light and Magic returned for Star Trek VI. However, due to the strict budget control, no new models could be built. The Enterprise miniature was the same one used since the motion picture, as well as the Klingon battlecruiser. The Excelsior, Bird of Prey, and Earth Space Dock models were all reused from Star Trek III.
But we received the models to do 6. And they showed up, and the Enterprise was in a big crate, and we pulled it open, and that was a beautiful model. It was about 8 feet long, had a gorgeous paint job, and just it was a showstopper. That was one of the most beautiful ships that we've ever worked with. But we opened up the crate, and much to our dismay, 2 things had happened. One, the wiring umbilical, which was about 2 inches in diameter, solid, with all the various wiring that went to the internal neons, the blinking lights, all the internal electronic stuff, had been just hacked off right at the side of the ship. So there was that, and then the other thing was the entire bottom of the saucer had been spray painted flat white. So all that beautiful paint had just been obliterated. So that, both of those things were really problematic and really time-consuming to correct.
When you work on a number of these films, your mindset, especially as a designer, is, okay, what can we do different, You've got your audience out there, and they want to see something new and different. So, yeah, the idea that the photon torpedo is like a cannonball, hey, let's see it go right through the thinnest part of the dish. Wouldn't that be cool? And that was an idea we proposed and ultimately got in the film.
And to do that, we made a large saucer. It's about 10 feet in diameter, and built a section of it that we could replace. Typically, if you're going to do pyro or those kinds of physical events with things coming apart, you usually build 3, just so you got enough to cover yourself, because you usually don't get it the first take.
That was a composite shot where we shot the large-scale Enterprise model, and then we built a large-scale section for a pyro piece, and we shot that upside down so it looked like it was in the vacuum of space. And you can't just blow anything up. You also have to structure the model in such a way that when it does explode, it looks like it's metal pulling back. So I think we used some very thin lead.
That was a big operation to put that all together. Build this in a large section of the ship, engineer the pneumatic part and all the breakaway sections to come out of it.
While the miniature effects didn't break any new ground, relying on motion-controlled camera techniques as ILM had done since the first Star Wars movie, new computer-generated effects were required. First was the shockwave from the Praxis explosion. Meyer's reference for the computer graphics team was the wave from the Poseidon adventure. The shockwave, nicknamed the Praxis effect, became a very popular asset, even being used for the Death Star explosion in the special edition of Star Wars A New Hope. For the assassination sequence, the team were required to create floating zero-G blood effects. The colour of the blood wasn't allowed to be red, as the film would be deemed too violent and resulted in R rating. Therefore, the colour was changed to violet. Although, as someone who is colourblind, I've always seen the Klingon blood as being pink. For the zero-gravity effect, a number of camera tricks were used to enhance the wire work. Whenever possible, the actors would be mounted on gimbals rather than hung from wires. For the shot of the 2 Klingons flying down the corridor after being shot, the set was mounted on one end, with the camera looking up at the 2 stuntmen being hung from wires. When the Klingons are hit by the phaser blasts, the 2 stuntmen were simply pulled up to the top of the set. For the phaser beams themselves, ILM employed the use of Photoshop, which was co-created by one of their in-house artists, John Knoll. For Martia's morphing effect, ILM used similar techniques to the ones used for the T-1000 in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. The Kirk doppelganger was achieved using a classic split-screen effect. For the film's score, Nicholas Meyer approached James Horner as the two had worked well together on The Wrath of Khan. However, Horner was unavailable at the time. Meyer then asked Jerry Goldsmith, but due to the failure of Star Trek V, Goldsmith was apprehensive about returning to the franchise, and so he turned down the offer. After listening to several demo tapes from composers, Meyer was quite taken by then 26-year-old Cliff Idleman's work. Meyer compared his musical vision to Igor Stravinsky's The Firebird, as well as Gustav Holst's The Planet Suite. Meyer was impressed by how quickly Idleman was able to submit his work, and after Paramount executive Steve Charles Jaffe compared his compositions to Bernard Herrmann, Idleman was given the job. Idleman chose not to mimic the work of Horner or Goldsmith, reasoning, "I couldn't do James Horner as well as James Horner." Idleman wanted to add some extra musical texture to the score, utilizing instruments from around the world, as well as integrating Klingon speech, like the aforementioned Tach Pa Tach Be, into the choir. And although Idleman didn't reuse Horner's main theme, he did reincorporate Spock's theme from The Wrath of Khan, this time made to sound much more ethereal. To commemorate Star Trek's 25th anniversary and build hype for the 6th film, Paramount held marathon screenings of all Star Trek movies in select cinemas across the United States, and re-released the films on home video in a brand new box set. The production had been a tough one, under strict deadlines and a tight budget, but on the 6th of December 1991, the final outing for the original series cast, Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, was released. After the low point of The Final Frontier, The Undiscovered Country is a breath of fresh air, and I won't beat around the bush, I absolutely love this movie. It's easily one of the best big screen outings for the entire franchise, and I personally rank it as being just as good as The Wrath of Khan. Nicholas Meyer's Hitchcockian sense of pacing and tension is on top form here. The surgically precise editing and economic camera movement establish a fantastic rhythm in every scene, which ensures every joke lands, every twist is shocking, and the final battle at the end is an intense, edge-of-your-seat finale. I said before in my Wrath of Khan retrospective that my one gripe with that movie was that it felt a little bit cheap at times, but Hiro Narita's cinematography for Star Trek VI goes a long way in making sure the lower budget isn't reflected in the movie's visuals. Letting certain backgrounds fall into darkness while using overhead reductive lighting creates crisp, clear images while also retaining a lot of depth. This is helped by the more graphics-heavy designs of the Enterprise and Excelsior bridges, which add a lot of colour to the background. ILM's visual effects work is excellent as always. The movie easily has the best beauty shots of the refit Enterprise model, and by this point the optical compositing techniques were essentially flawless. The CG effects haven't aged quite as well, but none of them really stand out as being especially bad looking. They comfortably perform their function as intended. Cliff Idleman's score for the film is one of the most unique in the franchise, but it's truly outstanding. The dark, foreboding tone of the opening is especially memorable, but there's also many wonderful uplifting cues throughout. But it's the mix of unique textures which really bring the music to life. The wide selection of percussive instruments and the use of choir make all the Klingon-centric tracks especially enjoyable. The heavy drums and sheer power of the brass featured in the action cues perfectly complement the great editing and direction in the final battle, and make a relatively small-scale set piece feel massive. While it may not be what I and other Trekkies think of as the quintessential Star Trek musical sound, it's truly brilliant work. When it comes to the cast, everyone is on top form here. After the embarrassing elements of The Final Frontier where Shatner's ego clearly got the better of him, he thankfully returns to the more mature, nuanced Captain Kirk of the second film and does a great job here as well. The classic banter and clashing perspectives between Kirk, Spock and McCoy is back with more wit and charm than ever before. Just about everyone in the regular cast gets some kind of big moment for their last outing. Chekhov has most of the funniest lines, but Uhura and Scotty are also given plenty to do during the hunt to expose the conspirators. Sulu becoming captain of the Excelsior is straight up awesome though. George Takei slips into the big chair with ease, and honestly it's a shame we didn't see more of this. It's the supporting cast though who feel like they're almost trying to steal the film from the regulars. Even Christian Slater's wee appearance is great. While Valeris is kind of a carbon copy of Savick, Cattrall's subtle sarcasm and wit make her a unique presence. Her portrayal of Spock and his resulting actions are actually very dark though, with the forced mind meld in particular being quite disturbing. De Soto's Azad Burr is as tough as a mountain rock face, the complete embodiment of Klingon leadership material. Just like Captain Sulu, I want to see more of this character. David Warner, meanwhile, has the natural air of a villain, but this is subverted with his reasoned and even warm presence at times. But it's Christopher Plummer who not only tries, he succeeds in stealing the movie. His enthusiasm for the character is clear as day, with him relishing every single line of dialogue. An alien yelling Shakespeare quotes in the middle of battle sounds silly in concept, but Plummer's wonderful scenery chewing makes it all work. Basically, everything he says is instantly quotable. I don't know if he was consciously trying to upstage his friend and rival William Shatner, but I think he succeeded. The political allegory of the end of Klingon Federation hostilities mirroring the end of the Cold War is on point and woven into the events nicely. But looking back at it from a more modern perspective, the same allegory also works as a way to close the book on this era in Star Trek as well. The Klingons as villains is such an iconic element of the original series and the 23rd century set stories in general. The Klingons transitioning into new kinds of characters is a nice metatextual way of moving the Star Trek franchise forward. Therefore, the themes surrounding being afraid of the future and the fierce resistance to change can also be seen as a commentary for the audience itself. It's these familiar characters who many fans see as embodying the very spirit of Star Trek, telling those same fans to look forward to the future and see where Star Trek might go next. Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country may start things off dark and foreboding, but it ends things on a heartwarming, optimistic note. It's charming, thrilling, and a work of real love for these characters. After the disappointment and/or embarrassment of The Final Frontier, The Undiscovered Country is a testament to the hard work and determination of the makers of this movie to ensure this swan song ended things on such a soaring high. Upon release, Star Trek VI was greeted with a reaction comparable to the often lauded Wrath of Khan. Critics and fans were largely very pleased with this last bow, praising the action, writing, and character-driven story. The film opened with over $18 million, the highest opening weekend of the series by that point, and went on to gross $96 million worldwide, matching the success of its better-received previous installments. It also sold well on home video, and its novelization became a bestseller. The movie was nominated for 2 Academy Awards and won the Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film that year. The success of the movie even made some of the cast briefly consider pursuing a 7th film, but after 25 years, they knew it was time. Since the original series debuted all the way back in 1966, the first family of Star Trek entertained millions worldwide in outer space adventures on the big and small screen. The series had gone from a cancelled low-budget show to a blockbuster film franchise. The cast had gone from a group of actors to icons of pop culture. But with their last feature film complete, it was time for all of them to move on, and it was time for Star Trek to reinvent itself for a new generation. Thank you for watching. Leave the video a like, and if you want to stay up to date on future uploads, hit the subscribe button and bell icon. You can also see videos early, uncut, and ad-free by joining me on Patreon. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank all of my patrons and members with an ultra thanks to Alex Miller, Eamon Kelly, Michael Hardy, Ian Hodge, County Ark, Mike Halsey, Retro PC Gamer, Benjamin Stokes, Hiroshi the Dog, Movie Magic, Charles Borsam, Olivia Computer, Bano, Extreme Streamers, Tom, Dusk, Colin Camille, Patrick Fleming, Matthew Camille, Ed Mark Starr, Dylan Thomas, Lilac Yane, Howard Craig Kervik, and Caging G. Thank you once again for watching, and until next time, have a good one.